At their lavish Christmas party, my billionaire son Kylan asked if I'd been enjoying the $5,000 monthly allowance he supposedly gave me. A blatant lie. He and his wife Isabella turned my lifetime of sacrifice into a cruel show for their wealthy friends. They thought I'd stay silent and disappear. They were wrong. Have you ever looked at the child you poured your entire soul into raising? The one you taught to ride a bike? The one whose scraped knees you cleaned? The one whose future you built with your own two hands? And asked yourself, in the dead quiet of your own heart, who is this person standing in front of me? Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew. Thank you for being here and for listening. If you're tuning in, I'd love to know where you're from, so please drop a note in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button so we can connect. My story isn't an easy one to tell, but it needs to be told. It begins on a Christmas Eve, a night that's supposed to be about warmth and family. But for me, it was the night I finally understood that I was a stranger in my own life. Kylan and Isabella's mansion was always cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that seeps in from a harsh New England winter. You can fight that with a good fire. This was a different kind of chill, a deep architectural cold that radiated from the acres of polished marble underfoot and the towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked out onto a perfectly manicured, lifeless garden. It was the cold of a place that was a house, not a home. That night the air was thick, heavy with the scent of fresh pine from a Christmas tree so large it looked like it had been airlifted from a national forest. But the natural earthy smell was suffocated by something else, the cloying sweetness of a dozen different expensive perfumes mingling in the air. The sound was a symphony of wealth, the delicate, high-pitched clinking of champagne glasses, the murmur of polite laughter, and the bright, confident chatter of people I'd never met, all of them dressed in dark, tailored suits and glittering dresses. I had found a small pocket of space near a towering bookshelf, hoping to become part of the scenery. My old wool sport coat, the best thing I owned, felt like a public confession. The fabric was worn at the elbows, a testament to a life of use, of work. Here, amidst a sea of crisp Armani and silk, it just looked tired. I felt like an old, trusted tool, a hammer maybe with a handle worn smooth by my own grip, that had been left behind by accident in a sterile, white-walled modern art gallery. People's eyes would pass right over me, not out of unkindness, but because I simply didn't belong. I didn't fit the exhibit. It was a feeling I was getting used to, this slow fade into invisibility. Then, through the crowd, I saw him. Kylan. He moved through his guests like a prince, a confident smile fixed on his face. And of course, Isabella was fused to his side, her arm linked elegantly through his, her posture perfect. She was a work of art herself, beautiful, and just as cold as the marble she walked on. They were a perfect pair. They made their way toward me, and the crowd parted for them as if on instinct. My son stopped in front of me and placed a hand on my shoulder. The weight of it felt strange. It wasn't the warm, familiar touch of a son greeting his father. It was a gesture of presentation, a placement. It felt distant, rehearsed, as if he were about to give a speech about a piece of antique furniture he'd recently acquired for his collection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kylan's voice boomed, cutting through the chatter. A hush fell over the room instantly. He had that kind of command. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." He paused, letting the silence settle, ensuring every eye was on him. "I'd like you all to meet my hero, my father, Matthew." Every head in that vast room turned in my direction. 100 pairs of curious eyes landed on me, the relic in the corner. I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. I could only manage a tight, awkward nod, my throat suddenly dry. The grand fireplace was roaring a few feet away, its warmth a physical presence at my back, but a deep, icy chill ran straight down my spine. This wasn't a tribute. This was the beginning of a performance, and I was the star, whether I wanted to be or not. Kylan squeezed my shoulder, a little tighter this time, a silent command to stand still. "My father," he continued, his voice resonating with a practiced, heartfelt sincerity that made my stomach clench, worked hard his entire life. He sacrificed everything for me. Now it's his time to rest. It's his time to enjoy the fruits of his labor. He looked around the room, making eye contact with his guests, his voice dropping into a more intimate, almost confessional tone. And that's why it's my greatest pleasure, my greatest honor, to make sure he receives a $5,000 allowance every single month so he can enjoy his life without a single financial worry. The room exploded. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a genuine, heartfelt ovation. The sound was deafening, a physical wave of noise that washed over me. I just stood there, frozen in place, my son's hand still heavy on my shoulder. My mind didn't just go blank, it fractured. 1,000 thoughts fired at once. $5,000? The number echoed in the sudden emptiness. I saw a flash of my cramped apartment, the peeling paint on the kitchen ceiling. I thought of the stack of unpaid utility bills on my small table, the constant low-grade hum of anxiety about making it to the end of the month. I had never, not once, seen a single cent of that money. I couldn't breathe. The sound of their hands clapping, the sound of their approval for this beautiful, monstrous lie, was a roar in my ears. It felt like waves crashing over my head, pulling me under into a dark, silent place. I was drowning, right there in the middle of the party. My eyes, desperate for an anchor, darted to Isabella. She was looking right at me, her perfect smile unwavering. But her eyes were not smiling. They were like chips of ice. There was no pride in them, no affection. It was a sharp, commanding glare, a silent and crystal-clear order that cut through the noise. Stay quiet. Play your part. Don't you dare ruin this. And in that one sickening instant, the whole ugly picture clicked into place. I wasn't a father being honored. I was a prop. I was an unpaid actor in their elaborate self-congratulatory play. I was a piece of scenery they had dragged onto the stage to prove their manufactured generosity, to sell this story of the devoted, successful son taking care of his humble, aging father. Her smile wasn't for me. It was the satisfied, predatory smirk of a director whose lead actor had just hit his mark perfectly. But the performance wasn't over. For the grand finale, to make the lie so real that even he seemed to believe it, Kylan turned to me. Right there, in the suffocating silence that followed the applause, in front of everyone, he leaned in slightly and asked the question that felt like a knife twisting slowly in my gut. "Right, Dad?" he asked, his voice dripping with a thick, fake concern that was more insulting than any curse. "You got this month's allowance already, didn't you?" I felt the blood drain from my face. The warmth from the fire vanished. The whole world seemed to shrink to the space between my son's face and mine. The air crackled with the weight of their expectation. They were all waiting, smiling, ready to be charmed by my humble confirmation. What could I say? What does a father do in that moment? Do you protect your son by becoming a liar yourself? Or do you protect your own soul by exposing him for what he is, right here, in front of the world he has built for himself? Do you swallow the public humiliation, the utter degradation, and become an accomplice to the assassination of your own character? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words were stuck somewhere deep in my chest, lodged like a piece of glass. I just looked at him, into the eyes of the boy I had raised, searching for a flicker of the child I once knew. And for maybe half a second, a single heartbeat, I thought I saw it. A flash of panic, of the shame he should have been feeling. But it was gone as quickly as it came, buried under years of practice. He pulled away, turning his back to me and facing his audience once more. He let out a dismissive, charming little laugh. "Oh, you know my dad," he said to the adoring crowd, "always so humble." The laughter returned, louder this time, a sound of relief that released the tension in the room. The play was over. The curtain had fallen, and I was left standing on the stage, alone in a crowd of strangers, feeling more invisible, more erased than I ever had in my entire life. That Christmas Eve, my son didn't just tell a lie. He took something from me. something far more valuable than any amount of money. In front of all those people, he took my dignity, and he acted like it was his to take. I left the party without saying a word. No goodbyes to the host and hostess I didn't know. No polite nods to the guests whose names I'd never learn. I just slipped out the grand double doors, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind me, and walked into the biting silence of the December night. The air was sharp and clean, a welcome shock after the suffocating, sweet perfume of the party. My old pickup truck was parked at the far end of the long, curved driveway, an island of rust and faded paint in an ocean of gleaming black sedans and silver SUVs. It looked small and tired, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a kinship with that old machine. We were both out of place here. The engine turned over with a long, pained groan, a familiar, protesting squeal of old metal that seemed to echo exactly how I felt inside. The heater had given up the ghost last month, another repair I'd pushed down the list of things I couldn't afford. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, feeling the deep, familiar cracks in the worn leather. It was a wheel that had molded to the shape of my own hands over 20 years of driving to jobs, to the hospital when Kylan was born, to Sarah's funeral. Cold air blasted through the aging window seals, a physical, invasive chill that went straight through my thin coat and settled deep in my bones. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the one that was spreading from the center of my chest, a creeping, internal frost that no heater, no fire, could ever touch. The drive home was a retreat into reality. Each mile that separated me from that marble mansion was a mile deeper into the truth of my own life. The perfectly paved, softly lit streets of Kylan's neighborhood, lined with silent, imposing houses that looked more like corporate headquarters than homes, eventually gave way to the familiar, cracked asphalt of my side of town. The Christmas lights here were simpler, a single string of colored bulbs around a door frame, a plastic snowman glowing on a small lawn. They were less ostentatious, but tonight they seemed to hold a little more warmth. Or maybe I was just imagining it. Tonight everything felt different, distorted. The world I thought I knew had been tilted on its axis, and I was struggling to find my footing. The lie, that big, glittering $5,000 lie, sat in the passenger seat next to me, a cold, heavy, invisible presence in the dark cab of my truck. My apartment is on the second floor of an old brick building that has seen better decades. There's no marble here, no grand entrance guarded by stone lions. The hallway always has a faint, lingering smell of dampness and cooked cabbage, a smell I've simply gotten used to. I fumbled with my keys at the door, my fingers stiff and clumsy from the cold, and finally pushed it open. The silence that greeted me was a different kind than the one in the mansion's driveway. That was an empty, expansive silence. This was a heavy silence, thick with the weight of loneliness and unspoken worries that had seeped into the very walls. I flipped a switch by the door. A single, bare bulb in the center of the ceiling flickered to life, casting a weak, yellow glow over my world. It was a small world, but it was real. My old, lazy boy recliner, its fabric worn thin and frayed at the arms from years of my elbows resting there, sat waiting for me like a loyal, tired old friend. Across the room was a small dining table with 2 chairs, a relic from a time when there were 2 of us, though only one ever got used now. And in the corner, my woodworking tools were neatly arranged on a pegboard, chisels, saws, and planes, all clean and sharp and oiled. I'd look at them sometimes and think they were the only things in my life that still felt completely honest, that did exactly what they were supposed to do every single time. This was my reality. No pretense, no performance, just the quiet, unvarnished truth of a life lived. On the kitchen counter, next to a small stack of unopened junk mail, was another pile of papers, the important ones. I knew what they were without even looking closely. My eyes were drawn to the one on top, a slip of pale pink paper that stood out from the white envelopes. The eviction notice wasn't for another week, but this was its angrier, more immediate cousin, the electricity shutoff warning. The words, "Payment overdue," were stark and unforgiving. Beneath it, a letter from my health insurance provider. 2 words were stamped in bold red ink, designed to make your heart skip a beat. Final notice. $5,000 a month. A sound escaped my throat. It was meant to be a laugh, I think, a bitter acknowledgement of the cosmic joke. But it came out as a dry, rasping bark, a single humorless sound that was swallowed by the heavy silence. $5,000. It was such an absurd, fantastical number. It was a magic wand from a fairy tale. A number like that could make all of this. The pink slips, the red stamps, the constant grinding worry that lived in the pit of my stomach, vanish into thin air. But it wasn't real. It only existed in the warm, champagne-scented air of that party, a puff of hot, meaningless words my son had used to buy the admiration of strangers. My hand went to my back pocket, an automatic motion I've made 1,000 times a day for 40 years. I pulled out my old leather wallet, the one my late wife Sarah had given me for our 10th anniversary. I remember her saving up for it for months. It was falling apart at the seams now. The leather softened to the texture of old cloth, but I could never bring myself to replace it. I opened it. Inside, tucked into the worn folds, were 3 $20 bills and a single five. $65. That was it. That was the real number. Not 5,000. 65. That was everything I had to my name to get me through to my next paycheck from the hardware store. I stood there in the weak yellow light, staring at the bills, and my mind started doing the grim, familiar arithmetic it knew so well. 20 for gas to get to work for the rest of the week. Another 30 for groceries, bread, eggs, milk, the absolute basics. That left 15. My blood pressure medication needed a refill tomorrow. The copay was $20. The numbers didn't add up. They never quite did. It was a constant, exhausting dance of robbing Peter to pay Paul, a shell game where I was always one step behind. Kylan's lie wasn't just a casual insult anymore. Standing there, with the shut-off notice on the counter and $65 in my hand, I understood it as a profound cruelty. It was a mockery. It was him, standing in his palace of marble and glass, casually inventing a fantasy that made a joke of my daily, desperate struggle to simply survive. He hadn't just erased my dignity in that room. He had erased my entire reality. I walked over to the lazy boy and sank into it, not bothering to take off my coat. The cold from the drive was still in me, and the apartment wasn't much warmer. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. The shock was too deep, too fundamental for a simple emotion like anger. All I felt was a vast, hollow emptiness. It was the feeling you get in the moments right after a car crash, that eerie, ringing silence before the pain screams through your nerve endings. You don't hurt yet, but you know, with a terrifying certainty, that something inside of you is fundamentally and irrevocably broken. I had spent my entire life building. I built houses for other families. I built furniture to fill them. And I built a life for Kylan. I worked overtime, took the extra shifts nobody wanted, wore my body down to a nub so that he could have a better start than I did, so he could build a world for himself. And he had. He'd built a magnificent one. And now, from the highest tower of that world, he looked down on mine and decided it wasn't worth acknowledging. He had simply written it out of existence with a few well-chosen words. My gaze drifted up and landed on the only picture I have hanging on the wall. It's a small, faded photograph in a simple wooden frame I made myself years ago. It's Kylan, maybe 10 years old, at the lake where we used to go every summer. He's grinning from ear to ear, a happy, goofy gap where a tooth used to be, and he's holding up the first bass he ever caught. His small hands are struggling to hold the slippery fish, and his eyes are shining with a pure, unadulterated pride. I remember that day like it was yesterday. The smell of the pine trees and the damp earth, the warmth of the sun on my shoulders, the sound of his squeal of excitement when he felt that first tug on the line. I remember the look on his face, the sheer, uncontainable joy. I remember the pride in his voice when he showed me the fish. Where did that boy go? When did he disappear? Looking at that innocent, joyful smile, a new feeling finally pushed its way through the numbness. It wasn't anger. It was an ache, a sharp physical pain deep in my chest, the kind of pain that takes your breath away. It was the final, devastating realization that I had lost something so much bigger than money, so much more profound than my own dignity. I had lost my son. I sat there in the cold silence of my apartment, the image of my son's smiling face in that old photograph burning in my mind. The numbness that had cocooned me since the party was beginning to recede, and just as the doctors tell you, that's when the real pain begins to set in. I looked down at my hands, resting on the frayed arms of the lazy boy. They weren't the hands of a retired man, a father being taken care of. They were the hands of a carpenter. They were a roadmap of a life spent working. The skin is thick, layered with calluses on the palms and at the base of my fingers from a lifetime of gripping hammers, saws, and sanders. There's a pale, thin scar that runs diagonally across my left thumb, a ghost from a chisel that slipped 20 years ago while I was building a set of kitchen cabinets. The knuckles are swollen, thicker than they used to be, a permanent reminder of countless hours in the cold, damp workshops of my youth. Each mark, each thickened patch of skin, told a story of 16-hour days during the busy season, of weekends spent in my own small workshop taking on side jobs, of every splinter and scrape I'd ever earned. And every one of those stories was, in some way, about Kylan. Those calluses paid for the latest Nike basketball shoes he just had to have. That scar was a postscript to the weekend I worked to buy him his first computer, the one he used to learn the skills that would eventually make him a millionaire. My hands had built his foundation, and he had built his palace on top of it, forgetting what lay beneath. My mind drifted back, pulled by the current of memory to the day Kylan got his acceptance letter to college. He was 18, full of that boundless, beautiful energy of a kid whose future is a wide-open road. He'd burst through the door, waving the thick envelope in the air like a trophy, his eyes shining with a light I hadn't seen since he was a little boy. We celebrated that night. I ordered his favorite pizza, and we sat at the small kitchen table, the letter spread out between us like a sacred text. But after he went to bed, the reality of it settled in. It was a great school, a private university with a price tag to match. It was far beyond anything I had saved. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at that same table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, the single lamp casting a small pool of light on my numbers. I wrote down my income, my savings, my expenses. I added, subtracted, and recalculated for hours, trying to bend the laws of arithmetic, trying to find a path that wasn't there. The numbers were stubborn. They wouldn't budge. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, I knew what I had to do. The next morning I went to the bank. I walked into that cold, quiet building and signed the papers to take out a second mortgage on our house. The house that Sarah and I had saved for, scrimped for 15 years. The house where we'd brought Kylan home from the hospital, where I'd marked his height on a doorframe every year. I signed it away without a second thought. I never told Kylan. I never wanted him to feel the weight of that sacrifice. I just wanted him to fly. When I got home, he was just waking up, his face still creased with sleep and worry. I just smiled at him, put a hand on his shoulder, and said the words every father has said in one way or another. You just focus on your studies, son. I'll take care of the rest. And I did. Years later, when he had graduated and was buzzing with the idea for his first startup, he came to me again. He had the vision, the drive, the intelligence. What he didn't have was money or space. He needed an office, a place to launch his dream. So I gave him mine. My workshop, the place where I made my living, was my sanctuary. The smell of sawdust and wood stain was the air I breathed. But for him, I cleared out half of it. I moved my table saw and my drill press against one wall, making room for 3 desks and a tangle of computer wires. For the next 3 years, my life had a new soundtrack. The familiar whine of my circular saw was now accompanied by the frantic clicking of keyboards and the low murmur of Kylan's voice on conference calls, pacing back and forth in my space, selling his vision to investors. The clean, sharp scent of pine and oak mingled with the electric, anxious smell of stress and burning code. I gave him the space, I gave him the time. I gave him my quiet, unspoken support, working late into the night after he and his friends had gone home, sweeping up the sawdust around their desks. I never asked for a percentage. I never asked for a dime. He was my son. That was supposed to be enough. I remember, a few years ago, after his company had finally taken off and he'd sold it for a sum I couldn't even comprehend, he came over to the apartment. He was different then, more confident, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck. He took my hands in his were smooth, manicured, and he looked me in the eye. "Dad," he said, and his voice was thick with what I thought was genuine emotion. "One day I'm going to buy you a house on a lake. It'll have the biggest workshop you've ever seen. You'll never have to worry about another bill for the rest of your life." I believed him. In that moment, I saw the boy from the photograph. I saw the sincerity in his eyes. That promise became a quiet comfort, a little beacon of light for the future. Now, sitting here in the cold, that memory felt like the cruelest joke of all. He hadn't just forgotten the promise. He had erased it and written a new story in its place. A story where he was the benevolent hero, and I was the grateful charity case, living comfortably on his monthly handouts. The deepest betrayal isn't about money. It never is. It's about the erasure. It's about the ingratitude. It's when the sacrifices you made, the pieces of your life you gave away freely and with love, are not just forgotten, but are actively denied. It's like someone taking your family photo album, a book filled with your most cherished memories, and carefully pasting the faces of strangers over your own, creating a new history that never happened. The man in Kylan's story, the father who received a $5,000 allowance, was not me. That man didn't exist. Kylan had created a new father, a more convenient one, a fictional character who fit neatly into the glamorous narrative of his new life. And in doing so, he had made me, the real man, the one with the calloused hands and the mortgaged house, completely invisible. I leaned my head back against the worn fabric of the chair, a wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like it was in my bones washing over me. A question began to form in the fog of my pain. What did I do wrong? Was it my fault? Did I give too much? Was I too quiet about my struggles? Did I make it so easy for him that he never learned to see the cost? The ache in my chest began to change. The numbness was gone. The deep sorrow was still there, but something else was stirring underneath it. It was a tiny, flickering ember of anger, a slow, quiet burn of indignation. I had spent my life building a future for him. Maybe, just maybe, it was time I started fighting to reclaim my own past. As a father, we spend our lives building things for our children, from fixing their first bike to helping with a down payment on a house. Have you ever stopped and realized you've given so much of yourself that you've forgotten who you are without them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, motionless in my chair. Hours, it must have been. The moon traced its slow arc across the sky, and the world outside my window went from the deep silence of the early morning hours to the first stirrings of the city waking up. I watched as the first pale gray streaks of dawn began to seep through the blinds, slicing the darkness in my apartment into thin ribbons. The room was still cold, the chill having settled deep into the old furniture and the wooden floors. But something inside me had shifted. The vast, hollow emptiness that had consumed me was gone. In its place was a strange and unfamiliar feeling, a cold, hard clarity. It was as if the emotional storm of the past 12 hours had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape that was devastated, yes, but also starkly, brutally clear. I had shed enough tears. I had felt enough pain. I finally understood that my silence, the quiet dignity I had always mistaken for strength, had been the very weapon they had used against me. It was the cage they had built around me, and I had willingly locked the door myself. That night, sitting alone in the pre-dawn gloom, I made a decision. I was going to take their weapon away. I would not be silent anymore. I rose from the chair. The movement wasn't born of impulse or anger. It was slow, deliberate, each muscle responding to a command that came from a place deeper than thought. My body ached with a fatigue that felt ancient, but my mind was sharp. I didn't walk to the kitchen to make a pot of coffee, to start the day as I always had. Instead, I walked to the corner of the room where my tools hung in their neat, orderly rows. My hand went past the saws and the levels, and I took down my framing hammer. It's a heavy tool, with a steel head and a long hickory handle that I've re-gripped myself a dozen times. I held it in my hand, feeling its familiar weight, its perfect balance. This hammer had driven thousands of nails. It had built walls, framed roofs, and assembled furniture that would outlast me. It was an extension of my will, a symbol of my work, of my very existence. It was a tool for building things up. Today, it would be something else. Holding it there in the quiet of my apartment, its cold steel a stark reality in my palm, it felt like an oath. My destination was the small, battered desk where I used to sketch out my woodworking designs. I opened the top drawer, passed the rulers and compasses, and took out a black, leather-bound notebook. It was a gift from Sarah years ago. She'd said it was for my brilliant ideas. It was too nice, too pristine for my rough sketches of cabinets and bookshelves, so I'd never used it. It was still empty, its pages clean and unmarked. I placed it in the center of the desk. I opened it to the first page. The sound of the crisp paper turning, of the spine cracking for the first time, was a thunderclap in the silent room. It was the sound of a beginning. From a jar on the desk, I took out a carpenter's pencil. It's not like a regular pencil. It's flat and rectangular, with a thick, strong lead designed to make clear marks on rough wood. The point was dull. I didn't rush. I took a small utility knife from the drawer and began to sharpen the pencil. Each stroke of the blade against the wood was careful, precise, shaving away thin curls until a perfect, chiseled point was revealed. Everything had to be just right. There was no room for smudges, for ambiguity. There was only room for the truth. In the weak, gray light of the Christmas morning, I leaned over the notebook and wrote the first words. My hand didn't tremble. My breath was steady. I didn't write about my pain, my sorrow, or my broken heart. There would be time for that later, or maybe never. What mattered now were facts. I wrote the date at the top of the page. December 24th, Christmas Eve party. And underneath I wrote the simple, undeniable truth. The lie about the $5,000 allowance. The letters appeared on the clean white page, stark and clear, each one as solid and permanent as a line carved into oak. This was not a diary entry, a place to pour out my feelings. This was an indictment. This was the first brick in a new foundation. And then I began to build. I started to list everything I could remember, every small detail that had felt wrong at the time but that I had dismissed, explained away, or simply been too tired to question. The unpaid bills, each with their due date. The exact day the heater in my truck finally died. I remembered the casual, almost bored way Isabella would sometimes make comments about my failing memory, when I'd forget a small detail, always in front of Kylan. I wrote down the times Kylan had deflected or changed the subject when I'd tried to ask him gently about his company's finances, making me feel like I was prying, like I was out of line for even asking. Each memory, each small slight, each unanswered question was a piece of a puzzle I had never realized I was supposed to be solving. Seen in isolation, they were just the minor frictions of family life. But written down, one after another, in the cold, hard graphite of my pencil, they were no longer random events. A pattern began to emerge. A dark, ugly shape took form on the page. This wasn't just neglect. This was a strategy. This was a series of deliberate actions, a quiet campaign designed to isolate me, to undermine my confidence, to paint me as a frail, forgetful old man who needed to be managed. They had a plan, and as I looked at the growing list in my black book, I realized that if they had a plan, then I needed one too. I sat there for hours, the notebook filling with my neat, blocky handwriting. The sun had climbed high into the sky, its light now streaming brightly through the window. but I didn't notice. I didn't feel tired. I didn't feel hungry. For the first time in years, maybe even a decade, I felt a sense of purpose. It wasn't a happy feeling, not yet. It was a grim, steely resolve. A carpenter knows that before you can build something new and strong, you first have to tear down the old, rotten structure. You have to pull the nails, pry apart the warped boards, and expose the decay. And as I looked at the evidence I had compiled, the blueprint of their betrayal, I knew exactly where I needed to start. My fight wasn't going to be loud. It wouldn't take place in a courtroom or a boardroom, not at first. It would begin in silence, the way I've always worked, with patience, with precision, and with the tools I understand best. My plan didn't begin with a confrontation. It didn't begin with an angry phone call or a dramatic showdown. A carpenter doesn't start building a house by shouting at the lumber. He starts by measuring, by planning, by understanding the materials. My plan began with a quiet trip to the public library. I hadn't set foot in the place for years, not since Kylan was in high school, and I'd occasionally drop him off to work on a research paper. But the moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the feeling of the place came back to me instantly. It was the smell, mostly. A unique, comforting scent of old paper, bookbinding glue, and quiet dust. And then there was the silence. It was a different kind of silence than the one that haunted my apartment. My silence was heavy, filled with absence and worry. This was a productive silence, a sacred silence, filled with the hushed rustle of turning pages and the low hum of minds at work. It was the silence of knowledge, of a million stories and a billion facts waiting patiently on the shelves. I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I felt safe here. In this place, I wasn't a failure or a prop. No one knew who I was. I was just another anonymous old man in a worn coat, seeking information. And for the first time in a long time, that anonymity felt like a shield. My black notebook was tucked into the inside pocket of my coat, its presence a firm, reassuring weight against my ribs. My first stop was the public computer terminals, a long row of beige machines lined up against a wall. I stood there for a moment, just watching. Teenagers typed with a blinding, effortless speed. A woman was paying her bills online, her fingers flying across the keyboard. For them, these machines were as natural as breathing. For me, they were alien territory. In Kylan's world, a world I had helped build, technology was power. In my world, it was an intimidating, complex engine I didn't have the key for. I finally chose a computer at the far end of the row, hoping for a little privacy for my fumbling. I sat down, the chair cold and stiff. The screen glowed to life, a bright, blank rectangle filled with icons I didn't recognize. I took a deep breath, the way you do before you lift something heavy. I could feel my heart beating a little faster. It felt foolish to be intimidated by a machine. But it represented everything about the world I no longer understood, the world where my son was a king and I was a peasant. I pulled out my notebook, opened it to the first page, and looked at the words I had written. I placed my hands on the keyboard. The plastic keys felt strange and clumsy under my calloused fingertips. Slowly, deliberately, I began to type the first words of my investigation into the search bar: ST Holdings. The name of the company Kylan sometimes mentioned in passing, always in a hushed, almost secretive tone. The screen blinked, and then it was filled with a cascade of information. Links, headlines, financial reports. It was overwhelming, a flood of corporate jargon and legal terms that made my head spin. I felt a familiar wave of inadequacy wash over me. This was his language, not mine. I spent an hour clicking through documents that were mostly gibberish to me, my frustration mounting. I was about to give up, to admit that I was out of my depth, but then I saw it. It wasn't a major headline from a national newspaper. It was a small article, buried on the third page of search results, from a local business journal dated 2 years ago. The headline was simple: Kylan Enterprises announces new asset management subsidiary, ST Holdings. My finger trembled slightly as I clicked the link. I read the short article, my eyes scanning the words, my mind racing to connect the dots. It described ST Holdings as a privately owned subsidiary, a separate legal entity created for the sole purpose of managing private family assets and investments. It was a shell, a legal box designed to hold things. My things? Sarah's things? I didn't know. But it was the first crack in the wall. I fumbled for a quarter in my pocket and printed the article. Standing by the printer, waiting for the page to emerge, was agonizing. When it finally slid out, the paper was warm in my hands. It was the first piece of tangible evidence I had. It wasn't a feeling or a memory or a suspicion. It was a fact, printed in black and white. The feeling was strange, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. It was like finding the first corner piece of a massive 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. I still had no idea what the final picture would look like, but at least now I had a place to start. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my notebook. I knew this single article wasn't enough. I needed more than just corporate filings. I needed history. I needed someone who knew my story, who knew the numbers. And my mind immediately went to Janet. Janet had been my wife Sarah's best friend since they were girls. When I started my small construction company, she was the first person I hired. She was our bookkeeper, our accountant, our everything, for over 20 years. Janet wasn't just good with numbers, she was a guardian of them. She was meticulous, sharp as a tack, and fiercely, unwaveringly loyal. She knew every dollar I ever earned, every loan I ever took out, every penny Sarah and I put away for Kylan's future. She was the keeper of our financial history. After Sarah passed, Janet and I had drifted apart, the way people sometimes do when the person connecting them is gone. We'd exchange Christmas cards, maybe a phone call on a birthday, but that was it. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my gut, that if I called her, she would help me. She was a woman who believed in things being right. The thought of making that call filled me with a profound sense of dread. There's a certain kind of pride a man has, a need to be seen as capable, as the one who handles things. Asking for help felt like an admission of failure. And to admit that the trouble was with my own son, that felt like a deeper shame altogether. I walked over to the payphone at the back of the library. I didn't want to use my own cell. It felt too traceable, too connected to Kylan's world. I stood in front of it for a full minute, the black notebook in my hand, my thumb tracing the outline of the printed article inside. I thought of Isabella's cold, commanding eyes at the party. I thought of the final notice stamp on the insurance bill. The shame was still there, but the cold, hard clarity I'd felt that morning was stronger. I picked up the heavy receiver, dropped a quarter in the slot, and dialed her number from memory. It rang twice, and then her voice, as crisp and no-nonsense as I remembered, answered. Janet Miller. My throat was dry. Janet, I started, my voice barely a whisper. It's Matthew Collins. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a confused pause, but a heavy one, filled with unspoken thoughts. For a second I thought she might hang up. Then she spoke, and her voice was warmer now, but still firm. Matthew, she said, and there was a world of meaning in that single word. I've been wondering when you'd call. I knew this day would come. Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees felt weak. I hadn't even had to explain. She already knew. I need your help, Janet, I said, my voice stronger now. It's about the old books. My books. I know, she said simply. Some things haven't added up for a long, long time. My office, tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. And Matthew, she added just before she hung up, bring everything you have. The line clicked dead. I stood there for a moment, holding the receiver in my hand, listening to the dial tone. The sound of that simple, steady hum was the most comforting thing I had heard in a very long time. I placed the receiver back in its cradle. A single, tiny flame of hope had been lit in the vast darkness. For the first time since that Christmas Eve, I didn't feel entirely alone. I had an ally. The call came 3 days after my meeting with Janet. It was Isabella, a rare event, to say the least. In all the years she'd been with my son, I could count on one hand the number of times she had called me directly. Her voice on the phone was like honey laced with something cold and artificial, a sweetness that didn't quite reach her tone. She said the automatic sprinkler system in her orchid greenhouse was on the fritz. She remembered, she said, that I used to be quite the handyman. Kylan is just so terribly busy at the office, she cooed, her voice a perfect performance of a concerned wife. I was wondering, Matthew, if you might have a moment to pop over and take a look. I would be so grateful. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs. There it was, dropped right into my lap. An invitation. A perfect, unimpeachable excuse to walk back into that house. Not as a charity case, not as a prop for their Christmas party, but as a worker. A repairman. Someone who would be left alone. Someone who could move around without suspicion. Someone who becomes invisible in a different way. It was a risk. A huge one. But it was also an opportunity I couldn't afford to waste. Of course, I said, keeping my own voice as steady and unremarkable as I could. I can be there in the morning. The next day, I prepared my tools. I laid them out on the clean floor of my workshop area, the old familiar weight of them a comfort in my hands. I wiped down each one with an oiled rag, checking the edges, the grips, the wrenches, the screwdrivers, the pliers. Each one a trusted friend. But the most important tool for today's job wasn't in my red metal toolbox. It was a small, heavy rectangle I'd bought from a pawn shop 2 days before. A slightly used off-brand smartphone. After my first trip to the library, I realized I needed a better way to gather evidence. I'd spent the better part of 2 afternoons back at one of those library computers, watching tutorial videos, teaching my clumsy thumbs how to navigate the slick glass screen, how to open the camera, and most importantly, how to take pictures and videos quickly and silently. I felt like a tired old spy in a cheap movie, practicing my tradecraft in the hushed quiet of the reference section. But when I slipped the cold, unfamiliar device into my coat pocket, it felt less like a prop and more like a weapon. When I arrived, Isabella was waiting for me at the door, dressed in an elegant white lounge outfit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She led me through the cold, silent mansion to the back, to a large, humid greenhouse filled with the most exotic and beautiful orchids I had ever seen. "Here it is," she said with a wave of her hand. "Just let me know if you need anything at all. I'll be upstairs in my studio." And with that, she turned and walked back into the house, her footsteps echoing lightly on the marble floors before fading away. The silence that descended was profound. It was a sterile, empty silence, broken only by the gentle hum of the greenhouse's climate control system. I got to work on the sprinkler system. It was a simple fix. A clogged nozzle, nothing more. A 10-minute job, maybe 15. I made it last for over an hour. I took the pipes apart slowly, cleaned them meticulously, and reassembled them with painstaking care. But all the while, my real work was listening. My senses were on high alert, every nerve-ending tingling. I was a hunter, in a territory that was not my own. I listened to the house. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of Isabella's footsteps moving around on the floor above me. I heard the distant chime of her phone. Each sound made my heart jump, my muscles tense. I was waiting for my moment, a window of opportunity. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of the garage door opening, and then the low rumble of her car starting. She was leaving. Now. It was now or never. I packed up my tools, my hands moving with a feigned slowness, and walked back into the house through the rear door, leaving it slightly ajar. My plan was to pretend I needed to use the washroom. Kylan's home office was on the ground floor, just off the main hallway. As I walked past, my heart hammering against my ribs, I saw that the door was slightly open. A sliver of light cut across the dark hallway floor. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just the quiet, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the house. I glanced up the grand curving staircase. The second floor was silent. My hand was slick with sweat as I reached out and gently, slowly, pushed the door open. The office was immaculate, sterile. It looked like a room from a magazine, not a place where anyone actually worked. A massive dark wood desk stood in the center, a sleek silver laptop glowing on its surface. Bookshelves lined one wall, the books arranged perfectly by size and color. My eyes scanned the room, searching for anything, any clue. And then I saw it. On the bottom shelf, almost hidden in the shadows, was a row of identical dark blue leather binders, and on the spine of one of them, in small, gold-embossed letters, were the words I had typed into the library computer: ST Holdings. My breath caught in my throat. I moved quickly, crossing the room in a few silent strides. My hand trembled as I reached out and pulled the heavy binder from the shelf. I opened it on the desk, my fingers fumbling with the clasp. The pages were filled with dense columns of numbers, legal contracts, and financial statements that I couldn't hope to understand. I flipped through them quickly, my eyes scanning for anything familiar. And then I found it. Tucked into a plastic sleeve in the back of the binder was a stack of check stubs. Canceled checks. My eyes locked onto the details. Pay to the order of Isabella Renault. The amount, $5,100. The date, the 25th of every month, going back for the last 2 years. My heart pounded in my ears, a deafening drumbeat. And then I saw the memo line, the small space at the bottom of the check for a note. In Kylan's familiar, messy handwriting were 3 words and 2 initials. Family expenses. MS, my initials, Matthew Smith. It wasn't an allowance. It was never an allowance for me. It was an expense. I was a line item in their budget. They were paying Isabella out of a corporate account to manage me. The lie was so much more insidious than I had ever imagined. They hadn't just invented a story for their friends. They had created a paper trail to prove it, turning my very existence into a business transaction, a cost to be managed. The gaslighting was so complete, so perfectly documented, it was designed to make me believe I was crazy if I ever questioned it. A surge of cold fury gave way to urgent panic. I had to record this. I pulled the pawn shop phone from my pocket, my thumb swiping clumsily at the screen to open the camera. The silent shutter of the phone's camera sounded like a gunshot in my head. I took a picture of the binder's cover, a picture of one of the checks, a close-up of the memo line. My hands were shaking so badly the first few shots were blurry. I forced myself to take a deep, steadying breath. Precision, Matthew. Be precise. I took the photos again, clear and sharp this time. Just as I captured the last image, I heard it. A sound from the hallway. The distinct, sharp click of a high-heeled shoe on the marble floor. Isabella. She was back. Panic, cold, and absolute seized me. I shoved the phone into my pocket. My hands flew as I slammed the binder shut, my movements clumsy and loud in the silent room. I slid it back onto the shelf, trying to get it perfectly aligned with the others, but my trembling fingers betrayed me. It was crooked. I didn't have time. The footsteps were closer now, just outside the office door. I bolted, slipping out of the room and pulling the door back to the exact sliver it had been before. I turned and walked, not ran, towards the back of the house, my heart threatening to explode from my chest. I didn't know if she had seen me. I didn't know if she had heard me. All I knew was that I had what I came for. But I had almost paid a price for it that was far too high. Sometimes, the most familiar tools become our most powerful weapons. I bet a lot of you out there are like me, trusting your old Craftsman or DeWalt set more than anything else. Has your toolbox ever gotten you out of a tight spot? Tell me your story. Janet's office was on a quiet side street downtown, tucked away in a second-floor walk-up above a small bookstore. It was the complete opposite of the glass and steel towers where Kylan conducted his business. There was no receptionist, no minimalist furniture, no sense of cold corporate power. Her office was warm, a little cluttered, and smelled richly of strong coffee and old paper. Stacks of files and ledgers rose from the corners of the room like miniature skyscrapers, and the walls were covered in framed photos of her children and grandchildren. Janet herself hadn't changed much over the years. Her hair, once a fiery red, was now a distinguished silver, but her eyes, magnified slightly by her reading glasses, were just as sharp and intelligent as I remembered. They were eyes that didn't miss a thing. She greeted me with a firm, brief hug before gesturing to the worn leather chair in front of her large wooden desk. I sat down, the old springs groaning in protest. I placed the large manila envelope I was carrying onto the desk between us. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained the weight of the last several years of my life. Janet looked at me over the rim of her glasses, then down at the envelope. A small, grim smile touched her lips. "Well, Matthew," she said, her voice a low, steady rumble. "Let's see the storm you've brought me." My hands felt clumsy as I opened the clasp. I didn't pull out the printed article or my notebook first. I pulled out the pawnshop phone. I slid it across the desk to her. "The pictures are on there," I said, my voice hoarse. "From yesterday." She took the phone, her movements efficient and practiced. She navigated the screen with a speed that surprised me, her fingers tapping and swiping until she found the photo gallery. I got up and moved to stand behind her, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen of her desktop computer as she connected the phone and brought the images up, large and clear. The first one was the blue leather binder, the gold letters of ST Holdings gleaming under the harsh light of Kylan's office. She just nodded, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Then she clicked to the next image. The check stub. She didn't say a word. She just sat there, leaning forward, studying the image on the screen. The name, Isabella Renault. The signature. And then, the memo line. Family expenses. MS. Her silence wasn't frightening like the silence in Kylan's mansion. This was the focused, analytical silence of a master craftsman examining a piece of wood, looking for its flaws, for its grain. Her finger tapped a slow, rhythmic beat on the surface of the desk. Tap, tap, tap. It was the only sound in the room, a small, steady metronome marking the time as she connected the dots that I could only feel. After several long minutes that stretched into an eternity, she finally leaned back in her chair, the old leather creaking in protest. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, her eyes still fixed on the screen. "Matthew," she said, her voice slow and deliberate, each word landing with a carefully measured weight. "This is worse than I thought. This isn't just them not giving you the money they promised in front of their friends." She pointed a single, steady finger at the screen. "This is them using your name, your initials, to actively pull money out of a corporate account. $5,000 a month. For at least the last 2 years, that's $120,000. She paused, letting the number hang in the air between us. "They've turned you into a ghost expense, Matthew. A phantom on their books." I had suspected it, of course. In the back of my mind, I knew the money had to be going somewhere, that the lie had to have a purpose beyond just public performance. But hearing Janet, a professional, a woman of facts and figures, say it out loud, it sent a chill through me that was colder than any December wind. A ghost expense. That's what I was to them. Not a father, not a man. Just a convenient fiction, a name they could use to siphon money for Isabella's shopping trips or whatever else they spent it on. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of their balance sheets. But Janet wasn't finished. Her eyes had a glint in them now, the look of a predator that has caught the scent of its prey. She swiveled in her chair and rolled over to a large metal filing cabinet in the corner, a relic from a pre-digital age. "I never throw anything away," she muttered, pulling open a heavy drawer with a loud screech. "Drives my kids crazy." She thumbed through a series of thick, dusty folders before pulling one out. My name was written on the tab in her neat, precise handwriting. She brought the folder back to the desk and opened it. Inside were old tax returns, copies of contracts, documents from a life I had almost forgotten. She carefully pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the original partnership agreement for my construction business, a document I had signed nearly 30 years ago. She laid it on the desk next to her keyboard. Then, she pulled up another one of the documents I'd found online during my library research, a corporate filing for ST Holdings that listed the board members. My name was on it, and next to my name was a signature. My signature. "Look here," she said, her voice sharp with discovery. She pointed from the old contract to the new document on the screen. At first glance, the signatures looked identical. The same loops, the same slant. But Janet saw more. "Look at the S in Smith," she instructed. "Your S, Matthew, has always had this little hook at the end of it." Always. Ever since you were a kid. It's a habit, like a fingerprint. She traced the signature on the old contract with her fingernail, stopping at the tiny, almost imperceptible flourish at the end of the letter. Then she pointed to the screen. This one doesn't have it. The loop is perfect. Too perfect. It's a damn good copy, I'll give them that. But it's a forgery. It's not your signature. There it was. The final piece. The one I hadn't even known I was looking for. The Holy Grail. It wasn't just about a lie at a Christmas party anymore. It wasn't just about a cruel financial arrangement. This was a crime. Forgery. Fraud. They had put my name on legal documents, documents that made me a part of their corporate shell game, and they had forged my signature to do it. This was the weapon I needed. This took our broken, tragic family drama and turned it into something the law had a name for. It crossed a line, a bright, clear line from which there was no going back. Janet looked at me, and the analytical sharpness in her eyes had softened into a look of deep compassion, mixed with a steely resolve. "Matthew," she said quietly, "you know what this means, don't you? You know what you have to do?" I nodded slowly. The wild storm of emotions that had been raging inside me for days, the shock, the grief, the rage, had suddenly gone quiet. In its place was a profound and absolute calm. It was the feeling I get in my workshop when I'm faced with a difficult piece of wood, a piece with a tricky, unpredictable grain. For a while you struggle against it, you fight it. But then, finally, you find it. You find the grain. You understand the nature of the material in your hands. And in that moment of understanding, you know exactly where to place the chisel. You know exactly how to make the cut. I carefully gathered the papers, the old contract, and took my phone. I slid them all back into the manila envelope. The rage hadn't vanished. It had simply been transformed. It had been cooled, compressed, and sharpened into a tool. I had the truth in my hands. Now it was time to start building justice. Before I left, Janet slid a small, crisp business card across her desk. On it was a name, simple and unadorned: Patrick Finney, attorney at law. "Patrick," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "He's not one of those flashy lawyers you see on billboards or television commercials, the ones with the blinding white teeth and the slicked back hair. He's a decent man, Matthew. And more importantly, he hates bullies. He's the one you need to see." The name felt right. Patrick. It was a solid, ordinary name. There were no fancy titles like senior partner or a long list of degrees after it. That gave me a sense of trust. I wasn't looking for a shark to tear my son apart. I was looking for a patient hunter, someone who knew how to track, how to wait, and how to strike at the right moment. I took the card, the sharp corner of it pressing into my palm, and it felt like the first step onto solid ground. Patrick's office was much like the man Janet had described, understated but solid. It was in a respectable but not extravagant downtown building, the kind with a quiet, wood-paneled lobby and an old-fashioned elevator. The office itself was neat, organized, and comfortable, with bookshelves filled with thick, leather-bound law books and a large window that looked out over the city. Patrick Finney was a man about my age, with a fringe of gray hair and a face that was etched with the lines of someone who had spent a lot of time listening. He rose from his desk when I came in, and his handshake was firm and dry, his eyes meeting mine directly. They were calm, patient eyes. I sat in the chair opposite his desk, the same manila envelope in my hands. This time I didn't hesitate. I opened it and laid out the contents of my quiet war on the polished surface of his desk. The black notebook filled with my precise, angry handwriting, the pawnshop phone with the photos of the binder and the checks, the printed article about ST Holdings, and finally, the two documents Janet had put side by side, the old contract with my true signature and the corporate filing with the forgery. Then, I told him my story. I started with the cold marble of Kylan's mansion on Christmas Eve and the weight of his hand on my shoulder. I told him about the $5,000 lie, the roar of the applause, and the icy command in Isabella's eyes. I told him about the drive home, the $65 in my wallet, and the final notices on my kitchen counter. I walked him through my memories, the second mortgage on my house, the workshop I gave up, the promise of a house on a lake. I explained my trip to the library, my fumbling attempts to use a computer, and the discovery of the first article. I described the tense, heart-pounding moments in Kylan's office, the smell of the paper, the click of the camera, and the sound of Isabella's high heels approaching in the hallway. I laid it all out, every painful, humiliating detail. Throughout it all, Patrick listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't check his watch or glance at his phone. He just listened, his full attention on me, his gaze never wavering. Occasionally, he would make a small note on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving with a quiet efficiency. But mostly, he was just still, a calm center in the storm of my story. When I finally finished, my voice raw, the silence in the room felt heavy with everything I had just unpacked. I expected him to start talking about retainers, about legal fees, about the odds of winning. I expected him to be a lawyer. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the desk, and he said 3 simple words. "I believe you, Matthew." Those 3 words. Hearing them from a stranger, a professional, a man of the law, it was like a dam breaking inside me. It was a validation so powerful it almost brought tears to my eyes. For weeks, I had been living in a nightmare world where my own reality was being denied, where I was being gaslit into thinking I was a confused, forgetful old man. Kylan and Isabella had created a fiction, and they were the only other people who knew the story. But now, someone else knew. Someone else saw the truth, and he believed me. In that moment, that belief was more powerful than any legal document, more reassuring than any promise of a courtroom victory. After a moment, Patrick's demeanor shifted. The compassionate listener became the sharp, strategic thinker. He began to outline a plan, his voice clear and methodical. "Okay, Matthew, here's how we proceed. We are not going to attack them head-on. Not yet. A direct lawsuit right now would be a mistake. It would give them time to hide assets, to destroy documents, to circle the wagons and build their defense." He picked up his pen and pointed with it as he spoke, as if drawing a map for me on his desk. "Our first move is quieter, but much more effective. We are going to use the law itself as our crowbar. I will draft an official letter of inquiry on your behalf, as a listed member of the board of ST Holdings. We will formally request a full accounting of all corporate documents, meeting minutes, and financial statements related to the company. We will specifically request copies of all expenditures listed under Family Expenses, MS. We're not accusing them of anything yet. We are simply, as a board member, asking to see the books. It is your legal right." Listening to him, my chaotic, emotional quest for justice began to take shape, to solidify into a coherent strategy. He was turning their own corporate structure, their own legal shield, into a weapon against them. "We will force them," Patrick said, his voice hardening slightly, "to hand us the very evidence we need to bury them." Then he stopped and looked at me, his expression serious. "But I have to warn you, Matthew, the moment they receive that letter, the war begins, and it will get ugly. They will not sit back and do nothing. They will come after you. They will attack your credibility. They will use their money and their influence to paint you as a confused, senile old man with a failing memory who is being manipulated. They will try to turn this into a sad family dispute, and they will use your love for your son as leverage against you. Are you prepared for that? Are you truly ready to see this through to the end?" I thought about it all. I thought about my calloused hands, the hands that had built a life for him. I thought about the house I had signed away for his education. I thought about the public humiliation of that Christmas party, the cold command in Isabella's eyes, the ghost expense in their ledger. I thought about the boy in the photograph, the boy I had lost. The calm I had felt in Janet's office returned, settling over me like a heavy, weighted blanket. "I've spent my whole life building things, Patrick," I said, and my voice was steadier and stronger than I thought it could be. "I won't let them tear it all down with lies." A small, satisfied smile touched the corners of Patrick's mouth. He nodded once, a gesture of finality. "Good," he said simply. "Then let's get to work." When I walked out of his office and back into the sunlight, I felt different. The weight in my chest hadn't disappeared, but it had changed its shape. I was no longer just a betrayed father, a victim of a cruel family drama. I was a client. I had counsel. And my quiet, lonely fight now had a name. It was a fight for the truth. A few days later, Patrick called and asked me to come by his office. When I arrived, there was a letter lying in the center of his otherwise clear desk. It was printed on his firm's letterhead, a thick, cream-colored paper that felt heavy and important in my hands. It looked official, serious, and very final. "This is our first step, Matthew," he said, his voice calm and steady. I read it over. It was exactly as he had described, a polite, professional, but legally undeniable request for Kylan's company, as well as its subsidiary ST Holdings, to provide a full and complete accounting of all financial records associated with my name. It didn't accuse anyone of anything. It didn't make threats. It didn't have to. The quiet, immense weight of the law was present in every carefully chosen word. It was a formal question, asked in a language they would have no choice but to understand. The letter was sent by certified mail that afternoon. I got a notification the next day that it had been received and signed for at Kylan's corporate headquarters. And then, a new kind of silence began. A day passed, then two. By the fourth day, the quiet in my apartment started to feel different. It wasn't the lonely, empty silence I had grown accustomed to over the years. This was a heavy, charged silence. It was the stillness in the air just before a thunderstorm breaks. Every time the phone rang, a telemarketer, a wrong number, my heart would leap into my throat. Every time I checked my mail, I half expected to see a response. But there was nothing. No angry calls from Kylan, no manipulative texts from Isabella. This wasn't the silence of neglect. It was the tense, coiled silence of a cornered animal, crouched in the shadows, trying to figure out its next move. I knew they had the letter. I could almost picture the scene. Kylan, his face pale and strained, Isabella, her honey-sweet mask falling away to reveal the cold fury underneath as she read the calm, polite words that threatened to bring their entire world crashing down. Finally, late one afternoon, nearly a week after the letter had been sent, my phone rang. I looked at the screen, and my breath caught. It was Kylan. I let it ring one more time, just to steady my own nerves. Then I answered. His voice wasn't the confident, booming voice from the party. The arrogance was gone. He sounded tired, strained, and there was a whining, pleading edge to it that I had never heard in him before, not even when he was a child. "Dad," he started, and the word itself sounded strange, like he was trying it on for size. "What are you doing? What is this? Do you have any idea what kind of trouble a letter like this from a lawyer can cause for my business? For my reputation?" He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't ask why, after all this time, I had finally done something. He went straight to how my actions were a problem for him. Patrick had walked me through this moment. He'd told me what to expect, how Kylan would try to make it about everything except the truth. "Stay calm," he'd said. "Don't let him pull you into an emotional argument. Just stick to the facts. The facts are your shield." "Kylan," I said, and I was surprised at how even and steady my own voice sounded, how it didn't betray the frantic hammering of my own heart. "I just want to see the truth. I just want to see the papers that have my name on them. That's my right." He ignored that completely, as if I hadn't spoken. He immediately tried to change the battlefield, to pull me back onto the familiar, treacherous ground of family feelings. "Isabella is a wreck," he said, his voice rising with manufactured desperation. "She hasn't stopped crying. She can't believe you would do this to us, to your own family. After everything we've done for you. You're tearing our family apart, Dad. Is that what you want?" He was trying to cast me in my old role, the confused, ungrateful, unreasonable old man who was causing trouble for no reason. He was trying to make me feel guilty, to make me feel responsible for their pain. It was a play I had seen before, and for the first time I refused to take the stage. "This isn't about Isabella's feelings, Kylan," I said, and I cut him off. It was the first time in years, maybe ever, that I had interrupted him. The words were quiet, but they felt like a solid wall. "This is about my signature. On documents. Documents I have never seen before in my life." There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. Not the charged, waiting silence of the past week, but a hollow, empty silence. I had taken away his script. I had refused to play the part of the emotional, irrational father. I had stated a single, undeniable fact, and he had no lines to respond with. In that moment of silence, I felt a fundamental shift, a transfer of power that was as real as the phone I was holding in my hand. I had drawn a line in the sand, not with anger, but with a simple, quiet truth. I was no longer an actor in his play. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The pleading, manipulative tone was gone. The fake concern had evaporated. In its place was something cold, sharp, and ugly. It was the voice of a spoiled child whose favorite toy had just been taken away. "You're going to regret this," he said, and the words were clipped, each one a little shard of ice. There was no sadness in his voice, no hint of the son I once knew. There was only venom. Then he hung up. I stood there in my quiet apartment and slowly lowered the phone. My hand was shaking slightly, a tremor I couldn't control. Patrick's warning had come true. They weren't going to give in. They weren't going to tell the truth. They were going to fight. The first shot had been fired. The first question had been asked. And the answer had come back, not in words, but in a threat. I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach clench, that they were about to fire back, and I had no idea what was coming next. I knew they would fire back. Kylan's threat on the phone had been a clear promise of that, but I was expecting a letter from a lawyer, a formal legal response to our formal legal inquiry. I was preparing for a battle on a field I was just beginning to understand, a field of documents and depositions. I was a fool. Their counterattack didn't come from a law office. It came from the shadows. It was quieter, more personal, and infinitely more cruel. It started with a phone call from my sister, Sarah's older sister, my Aunt Carol. She lives in Florida, and we don't talk often, but her voice was filled with a genuine, fluttering anxiety. "Matthew, honey, are you all right?" she asked, her voice thin with worry. "Kylan called me. He's terribly concerned about you. He said your memory has been a little shaky lately, that you've gotten some strange ideas in your head. He thinks someone might be taking advantage of you, telling you things that aren't true." I just stood there in my kitchen, holding the phone to my ear, completely speechless. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. It was brilliant in the most despicable way. They weren't going to fight me on the facts. They were going to discredit the man who was telling them. They were poisoning the well. They were going around to our family, to the people whose opinions I cared about, and planting the seeds of the story that I was losing my mind. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a whisper campaign, and it was starting to work. A few days after that, the real ambush came. It was a Tuesday morning. A sharp, unexpected knock on my apartment door made me jump. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door, and my blood ran cold. It was Isabella. She was dressed in a tasteful, expensive-looking cashmere coat, a somber, concerned expression perfectly arranged on her beautiful face. But she wasn't alone. Standing slightly behind her was a man I'd never seen before. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and a calm, professional demeanor. He was wearing a white coat. Not a doctor's lab coat, but the kind of formal white jacket a specialist might wear. "Matthew," Isabella said, her voice a soft, gentle murmur, but her eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "I'm so sorry to just drop in like this. This is Dr. Evans. We were just so worried about you, about what happened on the phone with Kylan. We wanted to make sure you were okay." They had brought a doctor to my door, unannounced. They had the sheer, unmitigated audacity to bring a medical professional to my home as if I were a psychiatric patient in need of an emergency evaluation. For a moment, I was so stunned, so utterly floored by the nerve of it, that I couldn't speak. My first instinct was to slam the door in their faces, but I knew that's what they wanted. That would be the act of a confused, angry, unstable old man. So I did the only thing I could. I took a breath, stepped back, and held the door open. "Please come in," I said, my voice a stranger in my own ears. They stepped into my small living room, and it felt like a violation. Isabella's expensive perfume immediately filled the space, a scent that didn't belong among the faint smells of sawdust and old books. The doctor's presence was an even greater intrusion, a clinical judgment on my entire life. He looked around my apartment, his eyes taking in my worn furniture, my simple surroundings, and I could feel myself being assessed, being categorized. Isabella began her performance. She played the part of the devoted, heartbroken daughter-in-law, wringing her hands, her voice filled with a sorrow that was breathtaking in its dishonesty. "We're just so worried, Doctor," she said, looking at him with wide, pleading eyes. "He's been forgetting things. He's been making these strange accusations. Kylan is just beside himself. We love him so much, and we just want to make sure he's getting the care he needs." Then the doctor, this Dr. Evans, turned his calm, professional gaze on me. He started asking questions, his tone gentle and condescending, the kind you might use on a frightened child. "Mr. Smith, do you often misplace things? Your keys, your wallet? Do you sometimes find yourself feeling confused about what day it is? Have you been feeling more irritable or suspicious than usual lately?" With every question, I could feel the trap closing around me. Isabella would nod sadly, occasionally chiming in with a little anecdote. "Oh, yes, he does forget things all the time, Doctor. Just the other day." She was building a case against my sanity, right here in my own living room, using half-truths and outright lies as her bricks and mortar. The shamelessness of it was almost paralyzing. I answered each of his questions as calmly and clearly as I could. I looked him directly in the eye. I told him about the complex joinery I was working on for a custom bookshelf, a project that required precise measurements and absolute focus. I told him about the history book I was in the middle of reading, and we discussed a point about the Civil War for a minute or two. I was fighting for my own mind, trying to prove my lucidity to a complete stranger who had been brought here by my enemies. But I knew, even as I was doing it, that his purpose here wasn't to find out if I was healthy. His purpose was to create a record, a professional opinion that they could use later. They were laying the groundwork so that when I finally presented my evidence, they could dismiss it as the paranoid ramblings of a senile old man. After about 20 minutes of this gentle, humiliating interrogation, they finally left. Isabella gave me a sad, pitying look at the door, as if I were a lost cause. "We'll be in touch, Matthew," she said softly. "We'll get you the help you need." The moment the door closed behind them, my legs felt weak. I stumbled back and sat heavily in my lazy boy. The calm I had maintained in their presence shattered, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, a real, terrifying fear crept into my heart. It was a cold, slithering thing. This wasn't about money anymore. This wasn't even about dignity. This was about my freedom. What if they succeeded? What if they found a doctor who would write the report they wanted? What if they managed to convince a judge that I was incompetent, that I couldn't manage my own affairs? They could take everything. They could get power of attorney. They could put me in a home. They wouldn't just be taking my money. They would be taking my life. They would turn me into a child, a true burden, completely under their control. My hand was trembling as I reached for the phone and called Patrick. My voice shook as I told him what had just happened, the words tumbling out of me in a rush of fear and outrage. He listened patiently without saying a word, until I had finished. "I was afraid they'd pull a stunt like this, Matthew," he said, and the simple calmness of his voice was like a lifeline. "It's a dirty, despicable tactic, but it's a common one when the stakes are high. Don't you worry. Don't let them get in your head. That's what they want." He paused, and I could hear him shuffling some papers on his desk. "The more they do things like this, the more desperate they look. Let them play their games. We'll document all of it. Every phone call, every unannounced visit. Every move they make is just another bullet they're handing us for our own gun. His words didn't make the fear go away entirely, but they contained it. They put a wall around it. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer a shapeless, all-consuming terror. It was now just another fact, another piece of evidence in my black notebook. The game had just become much more dangerous, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I absolutely could not afford to lose. The worst thing they can do is attack your mind, to say you've lost a step. I know a lot of us take our Centrum Silver or our fish oil every day to stay healthy and keep our minds sharp. Have you ever had to deal with people who dismiss the wisdom that comes with age? After Isabella's visit with the doctor, the fear that had taken root in my heart was a cold and constant companion. They had shown me that they weren't just going to fight me with lawyers. They were going to fight me with whispers, with suggestions of my own incompetence. They were trying to build a cage of doubt around me, and I knew I couldn't just sit inside it and wait. When I spoke to Patrick next, I could hear the quiet anger in his voice, but also a new sense of urgency. "They've forced our hand, Matthew," he said. "Fighting in the dark is what they want. It's where they can control the story. I think it's time we turned on a light." He then suggested something that, at first, felt even more terrifying than the doctor's visit. He wanted me to tell my story, publicly. He knew a journalist, a woman named Maria, who worked for the local city paper. "She's not a sensationalist," Patrick assured me. "She writes about social issues, about people who don't usually have a voice. Let her tell your story, Matthew. The truth is the best defense against their lies." My first gut reaction was to say no. Absolutely not. The idea of taking our family's private, painful business and laying it out for the whole world to see felt like a profound violation. It went against every instinct I had as a father, as a man from a generation that was taught to handle its problems quietly, behind closed doors. But then I thought about it. They had already made it public, hadn't they? They had stood up at that Christmas party and told a story for everyone to hear. The only difference was, their story was a lie. This was my chance, maybe my only chance, to tell the true one. The fear was still there, but the thought of letting their version be the only version was worse. I agreed to meet her. We met at a small, quiet coffee shop, the kind with mismatched chairs and the warm smell of roasted coffee beans. Maria was a woman in her 40s with kind, intelligent eyes and a notebook that was already open on the table when I arrived. She didn't have the aggressive, hungry energy I always associated with reporters. She just seemed present. She listened. I told her everything, all over again, but this time felt different. With Janet, I was seeking confirmation. With Patrick, I was seeking a plan. With Maria, I was just telling my story. I was trying to reclaim it. She didn't just write down the facts and the dates. She asked questions that no one else had. She asked about my workshop, what it felt like to build something with my own hands. She asked about Sarah, what she was like. She asked about the boy in the photograph, the one with the toothy grin holding the fish. She wasn't just seeing a legal case, a juicy story about a rich son and his poor father. She was seeing a human being, and for the first time, I felt like one again. A week later, the article came out. I was so nervous that morning I couldn't even eat. I walked down to the corner store and bought a copy of the paper, my hands trembling slightly as I paid the clerk. I didn't read it there. I took it back to my apartment and spread it out on my kitchen table. The article wasn't on the front page, but it took up a good portion of the local news section. It wasn't sensational. The headline was simple and direct. The carpenter's father and the $5,000 allowance that never was. The article laid out the facts, the ones Patrick had approved for her to use. It talked about the Christmas party, the public promise, and the reality of my financial situation, evidenced by the utility notices. It mentioned the forged signature on the corporate documents. Maria had been careful not to use Kylan's or Isabella's names, referring to them only as the millionaire tech mogul son and his wife. But anyone who had been at that party, anyone in their social circle, would know exactly who the story was about. She had told my truth, and she had told it with dignity. For a couple of days, nothing happened. The world felt the same. I started to wonder if it had been a mistake, if anyone had even read it. And then, the letters started to arrive. My mailbox, which for months had only been a source of anxiety, a place where bills and final notices appeared, became something else entirely. Tucked in among the junk mail were personal, hand-addressed envelopes. The first one I opened was from a man a few towns over. His handwriting was shaky, the writing of an old man. He told me his daughter and her husband had convinced him to sign over his house to them, promising to take care of him for the rest of his life. A month later, they had put him in a small, state-run nursing home and sold the house. He wrote, "I thought I was the only one. Thank you for making me feel less alone." Another letter was from a woman whose son had drained her savings account to fund a business that failed, and now he wouldn't even speak to her. She wrote about the shame, about how you can't bring yourself to tell anyone that your own child has robbed you. Each letter was a different story, but they all had the same heart. They were stories of quiet betrayal, of love being twisted into a tool for greed. They didn't know me, but they knew my pain. Every letter I read was like a voice in the darkness, a hand reaching out to me saying, "We see you. We believe you. You are not alone." It was Patrick who showed me what was happening online. He brought his laptop over to my apartment one evening and showed me the newspaper's website. Maria's article had been shared. A lot. First dozens of times, then hundreds, then thousands. He scrolled through the comments section. It was a flood of emotion. People were expressing their outrage at my story, but more than that, they were sharing their own. Story after story, from all over the country. A son who had stolen his mother's pain medication. A daughter who had taken out credit cards in her father's name. It was a hidden epidemic of heartbreak, a silent national tragedy playing out behind closed doors. Someone had started a group on Facebook, he told me. They called it The Forgotten Parents. He clicked on it, and I saw a page filled with faces, with stories, with a shared sense of grief and a newfound sense of solidarity. I read their posts for over an hour, and a profound realization settled over me. My problem wasn't just my problem. My pain wasn't just my pain. It was a quiet, creeping sickness in our society, a symptom of a world where money had become more important than family, where respect for the elderly had been replaced by a cold calculation of their worth. Isabella's visit with the doctor had been designed to isolate me, to make me feel like I was a crazy old man, all alone in my paranoid delusions. But their plan had backfired in the most spectacular way. The community's response was a powerful antidote to their poison. It gave me a strength I never knew I had. They wanted to silence my one small voice. But now, it no longer felt like I was speaking just for myself. I was speaking for the man in Ohio whose daughter sold his house. I was speaking for the woman in California whose son stole her savings. I was speaking for all the other forgotten parents in that Facebook group, the thousands of people who had been silenced by their own children. Their attack was meant to make me a lonely old man. Instead, they had turned me into a chorus, and a chorus of the truth is a hard thing to silence. The article in the paper, and the wave of support that followed, was a shield. It was a warmth against the cold fear that Isabella's visit had left behind. But I knew it wasn't a weapon. The letters and the online comments were a comfort, but they weren't evidence. The real fight, the one that would happen not in the court of public opinion, but in the cold, quiet rooms of the legal system, was still ahead. And then, about a week after the article was published, the weapon arrived. It came in a plain brown envelope, tucked in with the usual junk mail and a few more letters from strangers. But this one was different. It was addressed not to me, but to Patrick's law office. The address was typewritten, the letters crisp and anonymous. There was no return address. My heart started to beat a little faster. I didn't open it. I called Patrick's office, and his secretary told me to bring it right over, unopened. An hour later, I was sitting in that same comfortable leather chair, the mysterious envelope lying on the desk between us. Patrick looked at it, his expression unreadable. He slid it open carefully with a letter opener. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation, just a small black USB flash drive and a single folded piece of paper. Patrick unfolded it. On it were 3 typewritten words: "Check the accounting folder." We both stared at the little piece of plastic and metal. It was so small, so insignificant, yet it felt like a bomb sitting on the desk. "This could be anything," Patrick said, his voice low and cautious. "It could be a gift from a friend, or it could be a trap from an enemy." He looked at me. "Are you sure you want to see what's on this?" I just nodded. We had to know. He took the flash drive and plugged it into a port on his computer. For a moment, we both held our breath, half expecting a virus to wipe his system. But nothing happened. An icon simply appeared on his screen. He clicked it open. There was only one folder inside, just as the note had promised: accounting. He moved the mouse, the cursor hovering over the folder for a long moment. Then he clicked again. The folder opened to reveal a list of dozens of PDF files. They were all named with dates. Patrick opened the most recent one, and there on the screen was an email, and then another, and another. It was a long chain of correspondence between 2 people, Isabella Renault and a man named Alan, who was identified in the email signature as the chief accountant for ST Holdings. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, and I began to read, and a wave of nausea washed over me. It was all there, in cold, professional, businesslike language. It was a step-by-step instruction manual for their fraud. I saw Isabella, in her clipped, imperious tone, directing Alan to create a monthly consulting fee expense. I saw her instruct him to list me, Matthew Smith, as the recipient, and I saw her provide a separate personal bank account number, her own, for the direct deposit. It was a clear, undeniable, and meticulously documented record of their theft. But it was the last email in the chain that made the breath catch in my throat. Alan, the accountant, had apparently raised a question, a small voice of concern about the lack of supporting invoices. Isabella's reply was swift and dismissive. "Just do as I instructed, Alan," she had written. "Create a standard invoice. It's a non-issue. He's old. He'll never check." He's old. He'll never check. I had to sit back. The room felt suddenly hot, the air thick and hard to breathe. To see it written down like that, to see the casual contempt, the absolute certainty of my own irrelevance in their eyes. It was a different kind of pain. It was the pain of being utterly and completely dismissed as a human being. I wasn't a father. I wasn't even a ghost. I was a non-issue. Patrick scrolled through the rest of the files. It was all there. 2 years of fake invoices, of bank transfer confirmations, all leading to her account. He leaned back, a long, slow whistle escaping his lips. "It looks like Alan grew a conscience," he said, more to himself than to me. Maybe he got scared when our letter came in, and he realized this was getting serious. Maybe he read the article in the paper. Whatever the reason, he just handed us a loaded gun. These emails weren't just evidence of a lie. They were undeniable proof of a deliberate, calculated conspiracy to commit fraud. It showed that Isabella was the architect of the scheme, and it showed that Kylan, my son at the very least, knew all about it and did nothing. He was complicit in his own father's erasure. Patrick managed to get a number for Alan. He made a quiet, careful call, and a meeting was arranged. We met him at a small, out-of-the-way diner about 30 miles out of the city, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who calls everyone Han. Alan was a small, nervous man with thinning hair and eyes that seemed to be constantly darting around the room. He was clutching his coffee cup with both hands as if for warmth, though the diner was plenty warm. He told us he'd been with Kylan's company from the very beginning, back when it was just 3 kids in my workshop. "I watched him change," Alan said, his voice barely above a whisper, and it trembled slightly. "When he met her, Isabella, she has this influence. She's smart, and she's ruthless. She took control of everything, especially the finances." He confessed to everything. He admitted to creating the fake invoices, to processing the payments, to helping them forge my signature on the corporate documents. He said Isabella had threatened his job, his career, his family's security if he didn't comply. He was trapped. "I have 2 kids in college," he said, his eyes pleading with me to understand. What was I supposed to do? "But then," he continued, and he finally looked directly at me, "I read that article in the paper. I read your story, and all I could think about was my own father. He worked in a factory his whole life. He's gone now, but I couldn't be a part of something like this anymore, not after reading that." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "These are the originals," he said, pushing it across the table. "Everything. I'll testify. I'll sign a sworn affidavit. I'll do whatever you need me to do." We left the diner and stepped out into the cold evening air. Patrick put a hand on my shoulder. "Matthew," he said, and his voice was quiet but certain. "It's over. The game is over. We don't just have financial records and a forged signature anymore. We have an inside witness, a confession. There's no way for them to deny this now. There's nowhere left for them to run." I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. It felt clean, pure. The feeling that washed over me wasn't the triumphant joy of victory. It wasn't the satisfaction of revenge. It was just relief. A heavy, bone-deep relief. It was the feeling of a man who has been carrying an impossible weight for years and has finally been allowed to set it down. The road ahead was still long. There would be lawyers and courts and more pain to come. But for the first time, standing there in the parking lot of that little diner, I could finally see the end of it. After our meeting with Alan, the accountant, Patrick took the entire package, the sworn affidavit, the original emails, the forged documents, and submitted it to the district attorney's office. He told me the evidence was overwhelming, that they would have no choice but to open a formal investigation. And then, for the third time in this whole ordeal, a new kind of silence fell. This silence was, by far, the most terrifying. It wasn't the silence of neglect, or the coiled, calculating silence of Kylan trying to figure out his next move. This was the dead, still quiet of the legal machinery slowly beginning to turn. It was the silence of lawyers reading documents, of prosecutors evaluating evidence, of a storm gathering just over the horizon. Patrick explained that this was the time when Kylan and Isabella's high-priced legal team would be working frantically behind the scenes, trying to find a way to get the case dismissed, trying to cut a deal, trying to do anything to keep this from seeing the inside of a courtroom. Every day that passed without news, the tension in my small apartment grew thicker, more suffocating. I found myself jumping at every unexpected noise, my stomach clenching every time the phone rang. I was living on a knife's edge, waiting. That's when I started noticing the strange things. The first time I dismissed it as a coincidence. A black sedan, the kind with tinted windows you can't see through, was parked at the far end of my street when I left to get groceries. It was still there when I got back. The next night, I saw it again. I was watching television, and I had the feeling, that prickly sensation on the back of your neck, that someone was watching me. I went to the window and peeked through the blinds. The car was there, parked under a streetlight, a silent, dark shape. As soon as I looked, its engine started, and it pulled away from the curb and disappeared around the corner. It might have been nothing. It probably was nothing. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. I started to feel a low-grade paranoia creeping in. I started double-checking the lock on my door, something I hadn't done in 30 years of living in that building. I told Patrick about it. He didn't dismiss my concerns. His voice was calm but serious. "Be careful, Matthew," he said. "Keep your doors locked. Don't go out alone at night if you can help it. These people are cornered, and they're wealthy. That's a dangerous combination." Then, one morning, the vague sense of being watched became a direct, unmistakable threat. I opened my apartment door to get the morning paper, and I saw it. Tucked under my door was a plain white envelope. There was no stamp, no address. It had been placed there by hand. My heart started to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of cheap paper. There was no letter, just a single sentence, made from letters of different sizes and fonts, cut out from magazines and newspapers and pasted onto the page. It read, Curious old men have accidents. I stared at the words, my blood turning to ice in my veins. This wasn't a game of whispers anymore. This wasn't about trying to make me look senile. This was a threat. A direct, physical threat. They were trying to scare me into backing down, into dropping the whole thing. For a moment, it almost worked. I stood there in my quiet hallway, the ugly, pasted-together words burning in my vision, and I felt a tremor of real fear. I was just a carpenter, an old man. What was I doing, taking on people with this kind of money, this kind of ruthlessness? The final confrontation came 2 days later. It was a call from Isabella. Her voice was no longer sweet or concerned. It was flat, cold, and devoid of any emotion. She wanted to meet, not at her house, not at my apartment. She named a location downtown, the rooftop terrace of a new, half-empty office building her real estate company owned. It was a power play, and we both knew it. A public place, yet completely private. I told Patrick, and he advised me not to go. It's a bad idea, Matthew. There's no reason for you to talk to her. But I knew I had to. I had to face her one last time, not as her father-in-law, but as an equal. The wind on that rooftop was strong, whipping at my coat, a cold, relentless force. The sky was a uniform, dreary gray. Isabella was standing near the edge, looking out over the city. She looked small and elegant against the vast, empty sky, her expensive coat perfectly tailored, not a hair out of place. She didn't turn when I approached. "Do you really want to push this all the way, Matthew?" she asked, her voice calm, almost conversational, but it was carried away by the wind. "Family is everything. It would be a terrible shame if something happened to break it." She wasn't looking at me, but the threat was as clear as the threatening letter. It wasn't just about me anymore. She was talking about Kylan. She was reminding me that he was still my son, that he could be hurt in the fallout of all this. I walked to stand a few feet away from her, my own hands shoved deep in my pockets. I tried to keep my voice from shaking. "You're the one who broke it, Isabella, not me," I said, my words feeling small in the wind. "You broke it when you turned my son into your puppet." For the first time, she turned to look at me, and she laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a cold, brittle laugh that had no warmth in it at all. "Oh, Matthew," she said, with a dismissive little shake of her head. "Kylan is weak. He's always been weak. He has his father's sentimentality. He needs a strong hand to guide him, to make the hard decisions. You should be thanking me. I'm the one who built his empire." I looked at the woman standing in front of me, this beautiful, polished, and utterly empty person, and I finally saw her for what she was. There was no remorse in her eyes, no guilt. There was only a bottomless, insatiable appetite for more money, more power, more control. She hadn't just used my son. She despised him for his weakness, for the very parts of him that were still human. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear I had been carrying for weeks, the fear of their power, of their threats, just evaporated. It was burned away by the cold, clean fire of my own resolve. There was nothing left to say. There was no common ground, no shared humanity to appeal to. I turned my back on her and started walking toward the door to the stairwell. "This will be settled in court," I said over my shoulder, my voice firm against the wind. I didn't wait for her reply. I didn't look back. I knew, as I walked away, that there was no turning back. There would be no quiet settlement, no family reconciliation. They had shown their hand. They were willing to do anything, to threaten anything, to win. And as I stepped off that rooftop and back into the solid, quiet stairwell, I realized that I was too. The fear was gone, and all that was left was the unshakable certainty that I was going to see this through to the very end. After my meeting with Isabella on that windy rooftop, a new kind of quiet settled in. The threats had stopped. The strange cars were gone. It was just the waiting, the heavy, silent anticipation of what would come next. It was a week of checking the mail, of my heart jumping every time the phone rang. And then, one morning, the first real tremor of the earthquake I had started finally shook their world. Patrick called me, and for the first time in weeks, I could hear a note of genuine, unbridled satisfaction in his voice. "They've taken the bait, Matthew," he said, the words crisp with energy. "The DA's office just issued subpoenas. They're being served to Kylan and Isabella as we speak." I didn't fully understand all the legal terms, the difference between a subpoena and a warrant, but I understood the triumphant tone in his voice. This was a big step. Patrick explained it to me in simple terms. It meant the authorities, the official, faceless power of the state, were now formally compelling them to appear, to answer questions under oath, to turn over every single document we had asked for and more. It meant the great, slow, impersonal machinery of the law had finally engaged. And once those heavy wheels start turning, not even all of Kylan's money and all of Isabella's cunning could stop them. My quiet, personal, painful fight had now been taken up by a force much larger than myself. It was out of my hands now, and in a strange, unexpected way, that was a profound relief. The weight wasn't just on my shoulders anymore. The first visible consequence of that legal tremor appeared a few days later, and it came, as most things seem to, without warning. I don't read the financial news. The stock market is a foreign country to me. But Janet called, her voice urgent. "Turn on the business channel, Matthew," was all she said. I switched my small, flickering television to the channel, and there it was. A serious-looking news anchor was talking in that urgent, clipped tone they use for breaking news, and behind her, on the big screen, was a picture of Kylan. It was a professional headshot, the kind they use for corporate reports, showing him looking confident, successful, and visionary. But the words scrolling along the bottom of the screen told a different story. Stock plummets for Kylan Enterprises amid fraud investigation. The reporter went on to say that a judge, acting on a motion from the district attorney, had issued an order to freeze a significant portion of the assets of ST Holdings. She said they were also freezing several personal accounts linked to the investigation, including, she mentioned specifically, accounts belonging to Isabella Renault. I just sat there on my old lazy boy, the worn fabric familiar against my back, and watched. It felt surreal, like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. For the first time, my actions, the actions of a quiet old man in a small second-floor apartment, had reached out across the city and had a real, tangible, and very public effect on their glittering world. I had hit them where they lived, not in their hearts, not in their conscience, but in their bank accounts, the place where they kept their real valuables. It didn't take long for the phone to ring. I knew it would be him. The pleading tone from our last call was gone. The cold, venomous anger was gone. All that was left in his voice was raw, unfiltered panic. "What have you done?" he shouted into the phone, his voice cracking with a pressure I had never heard before. "The stock is in free fall! The board is calling for an emergency meeting! My reputation, Dad, everything I've built, my entire life's work! You're destroying it! Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted?" He went on, his voice a torrent of panicked accusations, a chaotic jumble of stock prices and board members and public relations nightmares. I just sat there in my quiet living room and listened to him. And a strange thing happened. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel the grim satisfaction of revenge. As I listened to my son, my only child, screaming about the collapse of his financial empire, all I felt was a deep, profound wave of sadness that settled over me like a heavy blanket. He still didn't get it. After all of this, after the lies and the forgery and the threats, he still thought this was about money. He still thought the most important things in the world were the things that could be bought and sold. He was so lost in the world he had built for himself, so completely and utterly blinded by its glittering surfaces, that he couldn't even see the simple human thing that he had truly broken. When his tirade finally ran out of steam, when all the frantic energy had burned away, leaving only the sound of his own ragged, desperate breathing on the line, I asked him one simple question. It was Isabella, wasn't it? I said, my voice quiet, not accusing, just tired. This was all her idea, wasn't it, Kylan? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. It stretched on for what felt like a minute. It wasn't an angry silence. It was a defeated silence. And then I heard a sound I hadn't heard since he was a little boy, maybe 8 years old, who had just broken a neighbor's window with a baseball. It was a small, choked sob. I don't know what to do, Dad, he whispered, his voice small and broken and young. I don't know what to do. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession of his own guilt, but it was an admission of his own weakness, of his own complicity, of his own foolishness. It was the sound of a boy who had followed someone down a dark road, dazzled by her confidence and her beauty, and had only just realized at the very end how truly lost he was. And my heart, the foolish, stubborn, and hopelessly irrational heart of a father, just ached for him. Listening to my son fall apart like that, all I felt was sadness. I spent my whole life trying to give him a legacy, a solid foundation of values to build on. But it seems he and I have a different idea of what a legacy is. What do you think is the real legacy a father leaves his children? Is it money and success, or is it the values you teach them? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. A week later, Patrick called again. Kylan's lawyers, a team from some big expensive firm, had been in touch. They were in full-blown panic mode. They're trying to make this go away, Matthew, he told me. They want to settle. They're offering a significant amount of money, a life-changing amount, enough to make all your financial troubles disappear for good. In exchange, you drop all the charges and sign a non-disclosure agreement. He paused, letting the weight of it sink in. They want to buy your silence, Matthew. They are terrified of this going to a public trial. I thought about the offer. I let myself, for a moment, truly picture it. A life without the constant, grinding worry about the next bill. A new truck, one with a heater that worked. Maybe a small house, somewhere quiet with a real workshop. An end to the fight, a quiet, comfortable life. I could finally rest. But then, my mind went to the shoebox under my bed, the one filled with the letters I had received. I thought about the man in Ohio whose daughter had sold his house from under him. I thought about the woman in California whose son had drained her savings to chase a dream. I thought about the thousands of faces and stories in the Forgotten Parents Facebook group, all the people who had been silenced, who had been made to feel crazy and alone and ashamed. This wasn't just my story anymore. It had become their story too. If I took the money and disappeared back into the silence, what would that say to them? It would say that justice can be bought. It would say that the truth has a price tag, and if your children are rich enough, they can afford to buy it. No, Patrick, I said, and my voice was clear, without a single trace of doubt. No settlement. I don't want their money. I want them to stand in a courtroom and answer for what they did. I want the truth to be told, out loud, where everyone can hear it. There was a moment of silence on Patrick's end of the line. Then he said, his voice warm with a respect that meant more to me than any amount of money, I knew you'd say that, Matthew. Get ready. The trial will be scheduled soon. I hung up the phone and walked over to the window. The last of the winter snow had finally melted from the branches of the old maple tree across the street, and I could see the first tiny green buds, no bigger than a pinhead, getting ready to open. The winter had been long and cold, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt the unmistakable hope of a coming spring. The night before the trial was the longest of my life. There was nothing left to do, nothing left to prepare. Patrick had told me to try and get a good night's sleep, but that was an impossible request. Sleep felt like a distant, peaceful country I might never visit again. I just sat in my lazy boy, the black notebook with all my careful records lying closed on the table beside me, a silent testament to the journey that had brought me to this point. The apartment was quiet, but my mind was a loud, chaotic place, replaying the events of the past few months over and over again on an endless loop. The Christmas party, the look in Isabella's eyes, the cold drive home, the pink slip on my counter, the flash drive in the anonymous envelope. I wasn't scared, not anymore. The fear had been burned out of me, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. It was the kind of tired you feel at the very end of a long, hard job, just before you put your tools away for the last time. I felt like I had spent months sanding down a rough, warped piece of wood, and all that was left was to see if the final piece would be straight and true. I was just waiting for the sun to come up, waiting for the final act to begin. Around 9 o'clock, there was a soft, hesitant knock on my door. It was so quiet at first, just a faint tapping, that I thought I might have imagined it, maybe just the old building settling. It came again, a little louder this time, a nervous, uncertain sound. I wasn't expecting anyone. Patrick and I had already said everything that needed to be said. My heart began to beat a little faster. I got up from my chair, my old joints protesting, and walked to the door. I put my eye to the peephole, the cold metal pressing against my skin, and my heart didn't just stop. It felt like it seized up in my chest. It was Kylan. He was standing alone in the dim, flickering light of the hallway, and he looked diminished. That's the only word for it. The confident, powerful man from the Christmas party, the man who commanded rooms and built empires with a smile, was gone. In his place was a stranger who looked lost and terribly, terribly tired. He wasn't wearing an Armani suit or $1,000 watch. He had on a simple gray sweater and a pair of jeans. His shoulders were slumped forward, his head was bowed, and he just looked broken. My first instinct, a powerful self-protective urge, was to keep the door locked, to not let him in, to protect the quiet, fragile peace I had fought so hard to find. But then, my second instinct, the one that had been wired into me for over 30 years, the instinct of a father, took over. He was my son. Whatever he had done, whatever he had become, he was still my son. I took a deep, steadying breath, turned the deadbolt with a loud metallic clank, and opened the door. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, and his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow like he hadn't slept in days. He looked past me, into the small, simple apartment that was his childhood, his past. He walked past me without a word and sat down on the small, hard-backed chair that sat opposite my recliner, the one Sarah used to sit in. He looked impossibly large and out of place, like a giant in a dollhouse. The small room seemed to shrink around his presence, his expensive, modern life clashing with the worn-out, honest history of the room. I closed the door, the click of the latch sounding final, and sat back down in my own chair, the familiar worn fabric a small comfort. We just sat there in silence for a long moment, the only sound the low, constant hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen, a sound that had been the backdrop to my entire life. "Dad," he finally began, and his voice was raw, raspy, like he'd been shouting or crying. "Please, I'm begging you. Call it off. Drop the lawsuit." He wouldn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on a spot on my worn-out rug, as if the answer to all his problems was hidden somewhere in the faded threads. "Isabella, they're going to send her to prison. The DA is making it sound like she's the only one responsible, but we're married. My company, the board is going to fire me. Everything, Dad. Everything I've ever worked for is going to be gone." He sounded like a little boy, a child who had just realized that his actions had real, inescapable consequences, and he was terrified. I didn't say anything. I just sat there and waited. I had learned over the past few months that my silence was more powerful than any words I could say. He finally looked up from the floor, and I could see the tears welling in his eyes, making them glisten in the dim light. And then, as if realizing his pleading wasn't working, the desperation turned to blame. "Why are you doing this to me?" he asked, his voice cracking with a note of childish, petulant accusation. "Why? I worked my whole life to get away from this," he said, waving a hand in a dismissive gesture around my small, simple apartment, "at my entire life. I worked to build something, to be someone. Why do you want to destroy that? Why do you want to tear it all down?" He was trying to flip the story one last desperate time. He was trying to cast himself as the victim, the hard-working son whose cruel, jealous father was trying to ruin his life. He was trying to make me the villain in my own story. I looked at him, at the man my son had become, and I didn't feel the hot surge of anger I expected. I didn't feel the cold satisfaction of pity. I just felt a profound, aching sadness that settled deep in my chest. I looked him straight in the eye. "Kylan," I said, and my voice was calm, steady, and quiet. It was the voice I used in my workshop when I was explaining something important, something that couldn't be misunderstood. "I'm only going to ask you one question. That night, at the Christmas party, when you stood in front of all those people and asked me if I'd received my allowance, did you know it was a lie?" He flinched, a physical reaction, as if I had struck him. He tried to hold my gaze, but he couldn't. His eyes darted away, back to the floor, to the walls, to the photograph of him as a boy on the wall, anywhere but at me. And in his silence, in that guilty telling flicker of his eyes, I had my answer. He had known. Of course, he had known. He had been a willing, smiling participant in my humiliation from the very beginning. "You stood there," I continued, my voice still quiet, not raising it, not filling it with accusation, just letting the simple weight of the truth do the work. "You stood there and you let your wife turn me into a punchline for her friends. You stood there and let her use my name, let her forge my signature, let her turn my life into a line item on her expense report. And you never said a single word." I leaned forward slightly in my chair. "You're not destroying your career, Kylan. You're not the one who destroyed this family. You and she did that a long, long time ago. This is just the bill coming due." My words weren't harsh. They weren't meant to be cruel. They were just the truth. And sometimes the simple, unvarnished truth is the most painful thing of all. He finally broke. He dropped his head into his hands, and a deep, ragged sob tore through him, a sound of absolute despair. He sat there, on that small, hard chair in my living room, and he cried. He cried like a lost child, his big shoulders shaking with the force of it. I sat and watched him, and I waited for the feeling I thought I was supposed to have. Pity, maybe, or a grim sense of victory. But nothing came. There was just a vast, hollow emptiness inside me, a quiet place where a father's love used to be. The man crying in front of me wasn't my enemy. He wasn't a monster. He was just a weak, lost boy who had made a terrible bargain, who had traded his own soul for a world of beautiful, empty things. And he had lost. I let him cry for a few minutes, the sound echoing in the small, quiet room. Then I spoke, and my voice was gentle, the way you speak to someone who is in great pain. "It's too late, Kylan," I said. "It was too late a long time ago. There's nothing left to say." I stood up then, the movement slow and final, the signal that this conversation and everything it represented was over. "Tomorrow," I said, looking down at my weeping son, "we both have to face the truth." Walking into the courtroom that morning felt strangely familiar. The room was large and cold, with high ceilings and polished wood that seemed to absorb all the sound. It had the same imposing, impersonal chill as Kylan's mansion. But there was one crucial difference. In Kylan's house, the truth was something to be hidden, to be papered over with expensive decorations and beautiful lies. In this room, the truth was the only thing that mattered. It was the foundation, the walls, and the roof of the entire structure. I sat at a long table next to Patrick, wearing my best suit, the only one I owned. It was old and a little worn, but it was clean and pressed. Across the aisle, Kylan and Isabella sat with their team of expensive-looking lawyers. They looked like they were carved from ice. Isabella's face was a perfect blank mask of cold indifference, her posture ramrod straight. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at anyone. Kylan was just a shadow of the man he had been. He was pale, his eyes were sunken and dark, and he seemed to have shrunk inside his perfectly tailored suit. He kept his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. I took a deep breath and glanced over my shoulder, and my heart, which had been a nervous, fluttering thing in my chest, suddenly felt steady. In the rows behind me, I saw Janet, who gave me a firm, encouraging nod. I saw Maria, the journalist, who offered a small, supportive smile. And scattered among the other spectators were 3 or 4 faces I recognized from the pictures in the Forgotten Parents Facebook group. They were strangers, people who had driven hours to be here. They had come to bear witness. In that moment I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was not alone. When my name was called and I was asked to take the witness stand, a jolt of adrenaline went through me. The walk from the table to the stand felt a mile long. Every eye in the room was on me. I sat down in the hard wooden chair, the wood cool and solid against my back. I was sworn in, my hand on the Bible, and my own voice sounded distant and unfamiliar in the quiet room. The prosecutor, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Davies, began her questions. My heart was pounding, but as I started to speak, a strange calm came over me. I wasn't telling a story to make people feel sorry for me. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I was just presenting the facts, the simple, unvarnished truth of my life, the way a carpenter presents a finished piece of work. I told them about the final notices, about the $65 in my wallet, about the heater in my truck that hadn't worked all winter. I told them about my hands. I held them up for the jury to see, the calluses, the old scars. These are not the hands of a man who has been living on a $5,000 a month allowance, I said simply. These are the hands of a man who has worked every day of his life. I told them about the Christmas party. I described the room, the applause, the look in Isabella's eyes. I told them exactly what Kylan had said and how it had felt to be used as a prop in their play. I didn't fill my story with anger or emotion. I just laid the facts out one by one, like bricks in a wall. And as I spoke, I looked at the faces of the jury, the 12 ordinary men and women who were listening, and I could see it in their eyes. They weren't just hearing me. They were understanding. When it was the defense's turn, one of Isabella's lawyers stood up. He was a slick, handsome man with silver hair and a condescending smile. He approached the stand like a wolf approaching a wounded animal. He started by asking me questions designed to make me seem confused, to twist my words. He brought up my age, asked if I sometimes had trouble with my memory. He tried to paint me as a bitter, jealous old man, envious of his own son's success. Then he paused, looked at the jury, and then turned back to me, his voice dripping with a false, pitying sympathy. "Mr. Smith," he said, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom, "isn't it true that this is all just a misunderstanding that has gotten out of hand? Isn't it true that you're just trying to get a large sum of money from your very successful, very generous son?" The room was absolutely still. The question hung in the air, ugly and poisonous. This was their whole case, right there in that one question. That I was a liar, that I was a greedy old man. I looked at the lawyer, this man who was paid a fortune to twist the truth into a pretzel. Then I turned my head and I looked, for the first time that day, directly at my son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Money?" I said, and my voice, which had been quiet and steady, was suddenly filled with a strength I didn't know I had. It rang out in the silent room. "You want to talk about money?" I looked back at the jury. I gave my son something worth more than all the money in the world. I gave him my life. I mortgaged the house my wife and I worked 20 years to own so that he could go to college. I turned my own workshop, my livelihood, into his first office so he could build his dream. I have never, not once, asked him for a single dime in return. I felt a lifetime of unspoken sacrifice welling up inside me, and I let it pour out. The only thing I ever wanted from him was respect, the simple respect a son owes his father. "And that," I said, my voice finally cracking with the raw, honest pain of it all, "is what you people took from me." After my testimony, they called Alan, the accountant, to the stand. He was a nervous wreck, his voice barely a whisper, but he was brave. He told the jury everything. He explained in painstaking detail how Isabella had instructed him to create the fake expense account, how she had told him to forge my signature on the corporate documents. And as he spoke, the prosecutor projected the evidence onto a large screen for the whole court to see. The emails from Isabella with her cold, dismissive words. He's old. He'll never check. The bank statements showing a clear, undeniable trail of $5,000 a month moving from ST Holdings directly into Isabella's personal account. I glanced over at her. Her face was still a mask, but for the first time, I saw a crack in it. A tiny, almost imperceptible muscle was twitching in her jaw. The invincible queen was beginning to crumble. At the very end, just before she rested her case, Ms. Davies, the prosecutor, had one last question for me. "Mr. Smith," she said, her voice gentle, "can you please tell the jury why you have put yourself and your family through all of this?" I took a deep breath. I didn't look at Kylan. I didn't look at Isabella. I looked back at the faces in the gallery behind me, at Janet, at Maria, at the strangers who had become my comrades. "Because being silent means you agree," I said, my voice clear and strong. And I didn't agree. I did this, not just for me. I did this for all the other fathers and mothers out there who have been forgotten, who have been dismissed, who have been made to feel invisible by their own children. I looked back at the jury, at the 12 faces who held my truth in their hands. I did this so they would know that their voices matter, that their sacrifices were real, and that their stories deserve to be heard. In that moment, standing on that witness stand, with the truth finally laid bare for all to see, I was no longer a victim. I was a witness. And my story, after all this time, had finally become the truth. After the final day of the trial, after all the evidence had been presented, and all the closing arguments had been made, the world went quiet again. The jury went into deliberation, and the rest of us were sent home to wait. In a way, these days of waiting were even harder than the trial itself. The trial was action, it was movement, it was a fight. This was just stillness, a heavy, suffocating stillness, filled with the unspoken question that hung over every moment of my day. It was a silence that was louder than any shouting I had endured. I tried to keep busy, to keep my hands occupied so my mind wouldn't spin out of control. I went to my workshop corner, the place that had always been my sanctuary. I took out a beautiful piece of oak I'd been saving, intending to start work on a small end table. I ran my hands over the smooth, cool wood, feeling the familiar patterns of the grain, a language I understood better than any legal document. I picked up my hand plane and began to shave off thin, perfect curls of wood, the blade making a soft, whispery sound as it moved, a sound that had always soothed me. I tried to lose myself in the work, in the simple, honest rhythm of it. But it was no use. My mind was a million miles away, in that cold, quiet deliberation room with the 12 strangers who held the remainder of my life in their hands. I'd find that my hands were still moving, sanding a piece of wood over and over, long after it was perfectly smooth, my muscles going through the motions while my mind was stuck in a loop of what-ifs. Every time the phone rang, my heart would slam against my ribs, a jolt of pure adrenaline that left me shaky. But it was never Patrick. It was just telemarketers, wrong numbers, the ordinary, mundane sounds of a world that was still turning, completely oblivious to the fact that mine had ground to a halt. The call came on the third day of waiting. I was just staring out the window watching the gray afternoon sky, when the phone buzzed on the table. I saw Patrick's name on the screen and my hand was shaking so badly I could barely swipe to answer it. "They have a verdict, Matthew," he said, his voice calm and professional, giving nothing away. "It's time to come to the courthouse." Sitting in the courtroom again, waiting for the jury to file in, felt like being underwater. The air was so thick with a collective, unspoken tension you could almost taste it. It was a physical presence in the room, pressing in on all sides. I sat next to Patrick, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking, my knuckles white. Across the aisle, Kylan and Isabella sat with their team of lawyers. Kylan looked like a ghost, his face pale and gaunt, all the color drained from him. He stared at nothing, his eyes completely empty, as if he had already left his own body. Isabella was the opposite. She was a statue carved from ice, her back ramrod straight, her expression a mask of bored, arrogant indifference. She was still playing the part of the wronged queen, even here, at the very end, in the face of her own ruin. The door to the side of the judge's bench opened, and the jury filed in. They walked slowly, one by one, their faces grim and serious. I found myself studying them, these 12 ordinary people, a mechanic, a nurse, a retired postal worker, who had listened to the most painful parts of my life. They wouldn't look at any of us. Not at me, not at Patrick, and certainly not at Kylan or Isabella. They just looked at the floor, at the judge, at the empty jury box as they took their seats. My heart, which had been fluttering nervously, settled into a cold, heavy stone in my chest. This was it. The end of the road. The judge asked the jury forewoman to rise. She was a woman about my age, with kind eyes and graying hair tied back in a neat bun. She had been a schoolteacher for 30 years. We'd learned during jury selection. She stood, holding a single piece of paper in her hand, but she didn't look at it. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at Kylan or Isabella. She turned her head slightly, and she looked directly at me. Her eyes met mine across the silent courtroom, and in them, I saw not pity, but a deep, quiet, and profound understanding. It was a look that said she had seen the truth. "On the charge of felony fraud," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing out in the silent room with an absolute finality. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Isabella Renaud, guilty." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. A low murmur rippled through the gallery behind me. Isabella didn't move a muscle, but I saw a faint, almost imperceptible tremor go through her. Her perfect mask was still in place, but it had cracked. The forewoman continued, her eyes still locked on mine, a silent communication passing between us. "On the charge of forgery, we, the jury, find the defendant, Isabella Renaud, guilty." This time, the reaction was more pronounced. Kylan made a small, choked, guttural sound and dropped his head into his hands, his whole body slumping forward as if the strings holding him up had been suddenly and violently cut. Isabella's face, for the first time since I had met her, lost its composure. It went completely white, the color draining from it in an instant, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll, beautiful and empty and broken. The judge banged his gavel, the sharp crack of the wood echoing in the stunned silence, calling for order. The sentencing was swift. The judge spoke of the calculated, long-term nature of the fraud, the exploitation of a position of trust. Isabella was sentenced to prison. Kylan, for his role as an accomplice, for his knowledge and concealment of the crime, was given a suspended sentence, 5 years of probation, and a fine so massive it would cripple even his vast fortune. His company was ordered to pay full restitution for the $120,000 they had taken in my name, plus interest and punitive damages. The numbers, the years, the legal terms, they were just noise to me. All I could hear were the 2 words, repeated over and over in my mind like a prayer finally answered. Guilty, guilty. As the bailiffs moved to escort a stone-faced Isabella from the courtroom and the lawyers began to pack their expensive briefcases, a quiet sense of order began to return. People started to file out, their voices a low buzz of conversation. As I stood up, my legs feeling a little unsteady, the jury forewoman walked past me on her way out. She paused for just a moment, right in front of me. She didn't say a word. She just looked at me, and she gave a small, simple nod. It was a gesture that lasted only a second, but it contained everything I had been fighting for. It was recognition. It was respect. It was one human being looking at another and saying, without a single word, "I see you. I hear you. I believe you." In that one, quiet moment, I felt the immense, crushing weight that I had been carrying on my shoulders for so long, the weight of the lies, and the humiliation, and the invisibility, simply lift. It wasn't a violent release. It just dissolved. It was gone. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, cold afternoon air. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs. I didn't feel the triumphant joy I thought I would. I didn't feel the hot satisfaction of revenge. All I felt was a deep, profound, and overwhelming sense of peace. It was the feeling of the ocean after a long and violent storm, when the winds finally die down and the waves settle, and all that is left is a vast, calm stillness. It was over. The fight was over. Justice, in its slow, grinding, and imperfect way, had finally been done. I didn't look for Kylan. I didn't want to see him. The bond between a father and a son is a strong thing, forged in a lifetime of shared memories and unconditional love, but it is not unbreakable. And ours had been severed, not by this trial, but by 1,000 small betrayals that had come before it. He would have to find his own way back, or not. It was his journey now, not mine. I turned and started walking home, alone. But for the first time in a very long time, the solitude didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like freedom. The freedom to finally, after all this time, begin again. The money from the court-ordered restitution arrived in my bank account a few weeks after the trial. It was a strange, surreal moment, seeing a number with that many zeros in it sitting next to my name on the ATM receipt. For so long, my bank account had been a source of quiet, constant anxiety, a number that I watched dwindle with every bill I paid, a number that never seemed to be enough. Now, it was something else entirely. My first thought wasn't about the things I could buy. It wasn't about a new truck or a fancy vacation. It was about the things I could finally put to rest, the ghosts I could finally exorcise. So the very first thing I did, before anything else, was not to look for a new car or a fancy apartment. I took my old checkbook, the one I hadn't used in months, for fear of overdrawing my account, and I sat down at my small kitchen table. I made a list from the stack of overdue notices I had kept in a drawer, a pile of papers that represented months of sleepless nights. The electric bill with its angry red stamp. The final notice from the health insurance company, a threat that had terrified me more than any other, the last payment on my old truck. I wrote out a check for every single one of them, my hand moving with a slow, deliberate care. With each check I signed, with each envelope I sealed and stamped, I felt a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. It was a feeling of profound, unbelievable relief, like finally being able to breathe after being held underwater for a very long time. I walked to the post office that afternoon and mailed them all. It was a simple act, just dropping a few envelopes into a blue metal box, but it felt like the true beginning of my new life. It was the closing of a long, painful, and deeply exhausting chapter. After the debts were cleared, I started looking for a new place to live. My old apartment, once a sanctuary, now held too many memories of the past few months, too many ghosts of lonely nights spent worrying and staring at the ceiling. I found a small ground-floor apartment in a quiet neighborhood, not too different from my old one, but with one crucial feature that made all the difference. It had a small private backyard, a little patch of grass, and a concrete patio. It wasn't much, but to me it felt like a kingdom. It was a place where I could put a few pots of tomato plants, a place where I could sit outside in the evening and feel the cool air on my face without the smell of the building's hallway. It was a place that felt like it had room to breathe. The next project was my old truck. I could have easily bought a new one, something shiny and reliable that didn't groan every time I started the engine. But that old Ford, it was a part of me. It was a rolling, rumbling archive of my life. It had been with me through everything. It had carried lumber for 1,000 jobs, its bed scratched and dented from years of hard work. It had taken Kylan to his first day of school, his small face pressed against the passenger window. And it had sat patiently in the hospital parking lot during the long, final days of Sarah's illness, a silent, steadfast companion. Getting rid of it would have felt like a betrayal, like throwing away a part of my own history. So I took it to a local garage, a small family-owned place run by a man about my age with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands. I told him to fix everything, not just the heater. I want you to go through it from top to bottom, I said.
Rebuild the engine if you have to. Fix the transmission.
And give it a new coat of paint, the same dark blue it's always been. He looked at me, then at the old, beat-up truck, and he just smiled a slow, understanding smile. "I get it," was all he said. A few weeks later, when I went to pick it up, it was like seeing an old friend who had just returned from a long, restful vacation. The outside was still the same familiar shape, the same old truck with its familiar dents and dings, but the engine hummed with a quiet, reliable power. It felt strong again. It felt a lot like I did. The biggest change, the one that meant the most to me, was what I did with the bulk of the money that was left. I didn't put it in the stock market. I didn't buy a fancy television. I rented a small, empty garage space a few blocks from my new apartment, and I built myself a proper workshop. Not just a corner of a room, but a real, dedicated space, just for me and my craft. I spent a month just setting it up. I built my own workbench from solid maple, making sure it was perfectly level and sturdy enough to last the rest of my life. I put up pegboards and carefully arranged all my tools, each one in its proper place, a place I could reach for without even looking. I installed new, bright fluorescent lights so I could see every detail of my work, every line, every joint. The smell of that new space, a mixture of fresh-cut lumber, sawdust, and varnish, that was the smell of my own resurrection. I started taking on small jobs again, a custom bookshelf here, a small repaired table there. Not because I needed the money anymore, but because I needed the work. I needed the joy of taking a rough piece of wood and turning it into something beautiful and useful. It was who I was. And I had almost forgotten that. One evening, Janet called. She invited me over for dinner at her house. It was a simple meal, just a roasted chicken and some mashed potatoes, the kind of comfortable, honest food I hadn't had in years. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where we'd had 100 cups of coffee over the years, and we talked for hours. We talked about the old days, about Sarah, about our kids when they were young and always underfoot. We talked about her plans to travel to see the Grand Canyon, about my new workshop. We talked about everything and anything except for Kylan and Isabella. Their names never came up. It was an unspoken agreement. That chapter was over. It was just so good to sit with an old friend, someone who had been there from the beginning, and just be, to laugh a real, easy laugh again. A few weeks after that, I was walking downtown, and I passed a specialty tool shop, the kind of place that sells high-end, imported tools for serious craftsmen. In the window, displayed on a piece of black velvet like a collection of jewels, was a set of Japanese carving chisels. They were beautiful, the steel a dark, gleaming gray, the handles made of a reddish, polished wood that seemed to glow under the store lights. I had wanted a set like that my entire life, but they were a luxury I could never, ever justify. They were for artists, not for a working carpenter who was just trying to pay the bills. I stood there, looking at them through the glass, for a long time. I thought about all the years I had denied myself the small things, the beautiful things, always putting the money away for something or someone else. And then, I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked into the store and I bought them. It was the first thing I had ever bought for myself that wasn't a necessity. It was a gift, a quiet acknowledgement that I was worth it, that my work, my passion, was worth it. After years of only buying the practical things, a sturdy pair of New Balance sneakers or a reliable pair of Levi's jeans, there's a special kind of feeling in finally treating yourself to something just for the joy of it, like a new St. Croix fishing rod or a special tool for your hobby. What was the first just-for-me thing you bought for yourself after you retired or had the chance to? I'd love to hear about that little joy. Most evenings now, I sit out on my little patio in the backyard of my apartment. I have a comfortable chair out there, and I'll drink a cup of tea and just look up at the stars. I don't think about the past as much anymore. The wound is still there, of course. A scar that deep never truly disappears. But it doesn't ache anymore. It's just a part of me now, a quiet reminder of the cost of silence and the strength it takes to finally speak the truth. I lost so much. But in the quiet of these evenings, surrounded by the smell of my tomato plants and the vast starry sky, I've come to realize that I've also found something again. I've found myself. A carpenter, a father, a free man. The months after the trial were quiet. I settled into a new rhythm, a life that was blessedly, beautifully ordinary. My days were spent in my new workshop, the air thick with the clean, honest smell of sawdust. I took on small projects, enough to keep my hands busy and my mind clear. My little backyard patio became my sanctuary, a place to sit with a cup of tea in the evenings and watch the fireflies begin their nightly dance. The storm had passed, and I was content to live in the calm that followed. I thought my story was over. It turned out it was just the beginning of a new chapter. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was Maria, the journalist who had written the article. After a few minutes of pleasantries, of her asking about my workshop and me asking about her work, she got to the real reason for her call. "Mr. Smith," she said, her voice warm and a little excited. "I'm not sure if you've been following it, but that Facebook group, The Forgotten Parents, it's grown. A lot. There are tens of thousands of members now, from all over the country." I told her I hadn't. I wasn't much for computers, and I had tried to put that part of my life behind me. "Well," she continued, "they're organizing their first community meeting. A small conference, really. It's next month, right here in the city. And they were hoping that you would come and speak, to share your story in your own words." She paused, then added gently, "Your story is what started it all, Matthew. You're the reason they don't feel so alone anymore." My immediate reaction was a polite but firm no. The thought of it sent a jolt of pure panic through me. "Maria, I appreciate the offer. I truly do," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I'm not a public speaker. I'm a carpenter. I wouldn't know the first thing to say. All I ever wanted was to get my life back, to have some peace and quiet." We ended the call on friendly terms, but my heart was still racing. Me? Stand up on a stage in front of hundreds of people and talk about the most painful experience of my life? It was unthinkable. I had fought my war in the shadows, with quiet facts and careful planning. The idea of being in a spotlight, of being the center of attention, went against every fiber of my being. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The peace I had so carefully constructed suddenly felt incomplete. I found myself pulling the old shoebox from under my bed, the one filled with the letters people had sent me after the article was published. I sat in my lazy boy and read them again, one by one. The shaky handwriting of the old man whose daughter had sold his house. The neat, careful script of the woman whose son had emptied her bank account. Story after story of loneliness, of invisibility, of the unique, bewildering pain of being betrayed by the very people you had given your life to. I had found my own peace. I had my workshop, my quiet evenings, my freedom. But what about them? What about all these other people, still living in the shadows, still feeling the shame and the isolation I knew so well? I realized that my own quiet peace would feel selfish. It would feel hollow if I turned my back on the very people who had given me the strength to see my own fight through to the end. My story had stopped being just my story a long time ago. It belonged to them too. The next morning, I called Maria back. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'll do it." The meeting was held in the large community hall of a local church. When I arrived with Maria, the room was already packed. It was a sea of gray and white hair, of faces etched with the lines of long, hard-lived lives. There were men in worn-out work shirts and women in their Sunday best. They were all older, and as I looked at them, I felt a powerful, overwhelming sense of connection. These were my people. My hands were trembling as I followed Maria to the small stage at the front of the room. A simple wooden podium stood in the center. When my name was called, a wave of applause, warm and supportive, filled the hall. I walked to the podium, my legs feeling like they were made of wood. I gripped the sides of it, my knuckles white, and looked out at the crowd. And a strange thing happened. The fear just melted away, because I wasn't looking at a crowd of strangers. I was looking at a room full of mirrors. In their eyes, in their patient, waiting faces, I saw my own story reflected back at me 100 times over. I saw their pain, their quiet dignity, their resilience, and I knew I was home. I hadn't written a speech. I didn't have any notes. I just started to talk. I told them about the Christmas party, about the cold chill of the marble floors, and the even colder chill of my son's lie. I told them about the $65 in my wallet and the final notices on my counter. I told them about my black notebook, about the feeling of sharpening my pencil in the pre-dawn gloom. I told them about the fear, the humiliation, and the quiet, stubborn resolve that had kept me going. I wasn't trying to be inspiring. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just telling them my truth, as honestly as I knew how. When I finished, a profound silence settled over the room. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a silence of shared understanding, of a truth so deep it didn't need any words. Then, in the back of the room, an old man with hands as calloused as my own slowly stood up. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he was trying to hold back. "Thank you for showing us we're not alone." And then, a woman in the front row stood up. "My daughter," she began, her voice trembling. "She told me I was crazy." And then another person stood, and another. They started to share their own stories, their own truths. The room, which had been so silent, was suddenly filled with the sound of voices, voices that had been suppressed for years, finally being set free. It was a chorus of pain, of resilience, and of hope. I stepped back from the podium, away from the spotlight, and just listened. And in that moment, watching this beautiful, heartbreaking, and powerful scene unfold, I finally understood. A man's legacy isn't just the house he builds or the business he starts. It's not the things he makes with wood and nails for his children. The real legacy, the one that lasts, is the hope he builds in the hearts of other people. After that first meeting, something new began. With the help of a few others from the group, including the retired school teacher who had been the forewoman of my jury, we started a small, non-profit organization. We found retired lawyers like Patrick, who were willing to volunteer their time to give free legal advice. We set up a support hotline, staffed by people who had been through it themselves, people who knew how to listen. My workshop is still the place where I find my own peace, where I can lose myself in the honest work of my hands. But this new work, this work with the forgotten parents, has given me something more. It's given me a new purpose. My pain wasn't meaningless. It didn't break me. It was forged into a torch, and now I get to use that torch to help light the way for other people, to help them find their own way out of the darkness. It's been a year now since the trial. The seasons have turned, and life has settled into a quiet, comfortable rhythm that I am grateful for every single day. The work I do with the forgotten parents has become a central part of my life, a purpose I never expected to find, but sometimes, in the quiet moments, I still think about Kylan. I don't know where he is. After the trial, his company was broken up and sold for parts. I heard through Janet that he and Isabella divorced almost immediately. She went to prison, and he just disappeared. I have no idea if he's happy, if he's found some kind of peace, or if he's still lost. The anger I once felt, that hot, burning rage, is long gone. When I think of him now, all I feel is a deep, lingering sadness. It's a quiet ache in a place deep inside me. I'm not sad for the man who sat in my apartment and cried, or for the man who stood by and let his wife destroy our family. I'm sad for the little boy in the photograph, the one with the gappy-toothed grin, holding up that fish. I'm sad for that boy, because he got lost somewhere along the way, chasing something he thought was more important than his own heart. I hope wherever he is that one day he finds his way back. Not to me, but back to himself. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my workshop, I'll stop what I'm doing and just look down at my hands. They're the same hands I've had my whole life. They're still a carpenter's hands, thick with calluses, the knuckles a little swollen, the skin cross-hatched with a roadmap of old scars and faint lines of ingrained sawdust. But I see them differently now. For most of my life, they were just tools. They were the things I used to build a life for my family, to put food on the table, to pay the mortgage. They were a symbol of my sacrifice. Then, for a time, they became the hands of a fighter. They were the hands that trembled as I pulled that binder off the shelf in Kylan's office. They were the hands that carefully wrote down the truth in my black notebook. The hands that held the phone as I made those terrifying calls. They were the hands that gripped the sides of the witness stand as I finally spoke my truth. Now they feel like something else. When I'm at one of our support meetings and I reach out and shake the hand of another man who is just starting his own journey, or put a comforting hand on the shoulder of a woman who is telling her story for the first time, my hands are no longer just tools for building with wood. They're tools for building connection. They are the quiet, steady proof of a life of hard work, yes, but also of a fight for dignity. And they are a reminder that the strongest things we can ever build are the bridges between us. This whole journey has taught me something I think I knew all along, but had forgotten. It's about silence. For most of my life, I thought silence was a virtue. It was the strong, quiet way a man handles his business, bears his burdens, and keeps his troubles to himself. But I've learned that silence has a dark side. It can be a safe harbor, a place to hide from the storm. But if you stay there too long, that harbor can become a prison. My silence is what allowed the lies to grow, to fester in the dark. My silence is what gave them their power. And I've learned that sometimes the bravest and most powerful thing a person can do is to finally speak, to find your voice, even if it trembles, to tell your story, even if you think no one is listening. You have to speak, because your story is real, your life is real, and you deserve to be heard. My life now is very simple. I have my workshop, my little backyard with its tomato plants, and a small circle of good, true friends. I don't have a mansion or a stock portfolio. I don't have a billion-dollar company. But I have things that are so much more valuable. I have my truth. I have my self-respect. And when I lie down in bed at night, in the quiet of my own home, I have a sense of peace in my soul. And those are the things that no amount of money in the world can ever buy. They are the only treasures that are truly worth a lifetime of work. So, if you're listening to this right now, and my story sounds a little bit like your own, if you're feeling like you're in the dark, if you feel invisible and alone, I want you to hear me. You are not alone. There are thousands of us out here, an entire community of people who understand what you're going through. Please reach out, talk to someone, find the help that is waiting for you. And most importantly, believe in the value of your own life, of your own story. Don't ever let anyone, not your children, not your spouse, not anyone, take your story away from you and try to write their own version over it. Your life is your own. It is a sacred text that you have written with your own hands, with your own sweat, and with your own heart. And you are the only one who gets to say how it ends. That whole experience of them trying to make me believe I was losing my mind taught me how dangerous it can be when good men stay silent. It's why I know that when we men, who've walked more than half a century on this earth, sit down together, the stories can just flow like a river. Today, I want to open my heart a little, and I truly hope I can hear your stories as well. You know, sometimes it's just a simple click, a like, a subscribe, or a share. To many, it might seem like a small passing gesture, but to me and to the quiet voices that need to be shared, every single one of those clicks is a ray of light in the darkness. It says, I see you. I hear you. Your story has value. After telling my story, what I want most now is to hear from you. In the comments below, I would be so honored if you would share a piece of your own story. Was there a time you felt dismissed or unheard? What passion of yours was once considered silly by others? Or what was a moment you found your own strength, even in a quiet way? Please share. I will read them and carry them with me because your stories are important. WAWA, Ages wants to build a community where we men, fathers and grandfathers, can share our truest experiences, the good and the bad. If you don't have anything sad to share today, please share a small joy. What made you smile today? If you're watching this on your television, don't hesitate to pick up your phone and find my channel, WAWA Ages. Let's work together to make this a community where no man has to feel like his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you for sitting here with me. It means the world.